All right, well, good morning, and thanks to those of you who've been able to join us already. We're so excited to be here with you to host this virtual event called A Path Forward, Public-Private Partnerships to Engage Communities and Expand Legal Services for Immigrants. While you are getting logged in, we do hope that you can do us a favor and update your Zoom screen name to include your full name in your organization so that we know who's in the room and so that we can make sure to appropriately call on you as needed and or hear from you as needed. Just a couple of housekeeping things that this, as you might have noticed, this event is being recorded. You should have received a notification when you logged into Zoom, and I believe that recording will be shared. So we are so excited to be here today as the host for you with this event. The next slide shows that I am Erica Manuel. I am the CEO and Executive Director of the Institute for Local Government. And I am excited to be joined today by my colleagues Julia Salinas, she's a Senior Manager of Equity and Public Engagement, and Nikita Sinha, she's a Program Manager with ILG. We're so excited to host this event today in partnership with some really exceptional organizations. And we're so happy to have you on the line to learn a little bit more about opportunities for public-private partnerships, opportunities to really increase and expand impact when we think about connecting with our immigrant communities. Before we jump into some of the details for today, I did want to give you a little bit of a download about the Institute for Local Government for those of you that don't know. We are nonprofit, we are nonpartisan, and we are really committed to engaging communities and building trust. We specifically work with local agencies, cities, counties, and special districts, and we really help them navigate the complexity of their roles with the intention of helping them increase capacity, build trust in their communities. We are affiliated with 3 very large associations across the state of California, and together with those associations, we support over 2,500 local agencies and many, many thousands and thousands of local government leaders at cities, counties, and special districts. Our program areas are showing on this slide. We do work from leadership and governance to civics education and workforce, public engagement, and sustainable and resilient communities. And we do that through education and training, technical assistance, capacity building, and convenings like this one, where we're talking about issues of importance, issues that are complicated, issues that are complex, really thinking about how can we operationalize things like equity, operationalize things like engagement on the ground, and in a meaningful and authentic way with communities that we serve. And when you think about local government and you think about complexity and you think about all of the things that we are responsible for as local leaders with our communities, you know, this is one issue in particular that I think has some complexity attached to it. And there's a lot of opportunity for us to think differently and to innovate in this space. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so excited for ILG to partner in this event today. Next slide. So we are really, really pleased to co-host this event with a couple of amazing partners, including Grantmakers Concerned with Immigrants and Refugees, the Grow Foundation, and the Zellerbach Family Foundation. And our intention here is, our goal is to bring local governments and foundations together to learn about the needs of California's immigrant communities, to hear about new partnerships between local government and philanthropy, and to expand legal services for immigrants, really creating those regional connections for local government and for funders. And like I said, we are really excited about the opportunity to think differently, to engage differently, and to really be connected, because as important residents in our communities, it is the responsibility of local agencies to identify opportunities and solutions in this space. And that's one of the reasons why ILG is happy to partner today with these event partners. We are joined today by representatives from these organizations. The first is Navid Mool. She's the program executive with the Zellerbach Family Foundation. Sarah Campos, she's the Senior Program Officer for the Grow Foundation. We also have Ivy Siriopas, she's the Vice President with Grantmakers Concerned with Immigrants and Refugees, and Kevin Douglas, who's their Director of National Programs. And to kick us off today with our program, I'm actually going to hand it over to Ivy next.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm very much looking forward to this conversation. My name is Ivy Siriopas. I'm the Vice President of Programs at Grantmakers Concerned with Immigrants and Refugees, or GCIR for short. My pronouns are she, her, hers. Just some background about GCIR. We were founded in 1990, more than 30 years ago. We're the nation's only immigrant-focused philanthropic serving organization with more than 130 members and individual grant makers totaling at least 1,200 in our network. We have partners in the field as well as other PSOs to mobilize money and power dedicated to uplifting the contributions and addressing the needs of both immigrant and refugee populations. Our members include local, state, and national foundations with diverse grant-making priorities. We conduct briefings, publications, consultations, and convenings like this one, and really try to catalyze, coordinate grant-making for maximum strategic impact, leading us to have mobilized millions of dollars to immigrant communities nationwide. This particular moment is critical, with the state of California being home to 11 million immigrants, which is a quarter of the foreign-born population. There's just a critical need for legal services. There's a dramatic mismatch between the needs and the actual provision of legal services. So that's why this conversation is so important today. We're embarking on an opportunity right now to help philanthropy, help providers to meet this demand and to shore up the infrastructure for legal services. And this particular conversation and helping to provide local government and philanthropy with knowledge to support these efforts to provide critical legal services to immigrants will provide complementary efforts to be greater than the sum of their individual parts. And with that, I'll hand it back to ILD.
Excellent, thank you, Ivy. All right, well, I'd love to introduce the agenda for today in a little bit more detail. So first, we'll have a speaker talk a bit about the national and regional immigration context. Then we'll do some Q&A, take a break, probably around 9:45 or so, and then dive into some research findings here from a legal services report focused on immigrant legal service needs in California. And then we'll dive into the public-private partnership panel, hearing from a variety of speakers that represent local governments, foundations, and the Immigration Policy Institute. And then the last 30 minutes of our session will be small group discussion, where we'll get a chance to break out into groups by region, bringing together funders and local governments to share about their needs and experiences related to immigrant services. So we've got a great agenda here, and we'll kind of flow through and introduce the speakers in more detail as we go along. So a few Zoom housekeeping rules. We have everyone's audio muted automatically throughout the meeting. Please also check that your screen name and organization are listed correctly. To rename yourself, you can select the 3 dots at the top right of your video and select rename. We'd love to know who all is in the room. And if you have any questions or comments for the presenters throughout their presentations, please put your message in the chat box, and the Q&A will be moderated by myself and Kevin, who will be introduced a little bit later. And we'll make sure to get those questions answered and share comments. We'll be recording the main session, and we'll be able to share it afterwards. We will be recording breakout rooms, but not sharing the breakout room discussions. It's really just for our note-taking purposes. So it's a few of the Zoom housekeeping rules. Also, if you have any tech questions, please just put in the chat, I'm having trouble connecting, or I can't hear, or whatever it is, please feel free to reach out and we can have someone help you as well. In terms of meeting ground rules, we want to make sure that everyone is respecting the goals of the meeting, respecting each other, that you're open to other points of views, that we all listen with an open mind and make space for everyone to participate. So this will be especially helpful in the small group breakouts as well, as we get a chance to dive in together. All right, so next I would like to introduce Essie Workey, who is a senior policy analyst at the Migration Policy Institute. Essie, feel free to take it away.
Thank you, Julia. I appreciate those ground rules so much. What a nice way to level set and begin the conversation. As Julia noted, my name is Essie Workey. I'm a senior policy analyst at MPI, Migration Policy Institute. And I'm very honored to be here with you all today. I want to thank the conveners and partners responsible for this gathering for inviting me. It's a really important conversation that we're about to embark on that can change lives. And I want to share too that I've worked at many different levels of government, including county government in Virginia and the federal government, about 20 years of human services work, with the last 10 or so years focused specifically on immigrant groups and integration. MPI is a research institute based in DC, but with reach in Europe, Latin America, and other regions of the world. And we focus on research and analysis around migration, integration, and immigration. So it's with all of that in mind that I come to you today. And the top line message for the brief remarks that I'll offer is that no matter what area of work you're in, if you're serving people, then you're serving immigrants as well. And you'll see as we go through that immigrants in the country, as well as in California specifically, are your coworkers, your neighbors, your family members, perhaps you yourself, and they're relevant for different areas of work, including schools, workforce development, safety net benefit programs like Medicaid and CalWorks and so forth, as well as anyone working with an equity lens. So here in just a moment, I'll cover some demographic characteristics to illustrate this point. And then I'll also feature two specific groups of interest, namely Afghan evacuees and unaccompanied children who've crossed the southern border. So going to the next slide, just to level set on the share of immigrants in California, 1 in 4 people are immigrants. And of course, California has a greater share of immigrants than the nation as a whole or many other states. Nationally, we're roughly looking at 13 to 14% of the population being immigrants. And this includes people who have naturalized as US citizens, as well as people who don't have any lawful immigration status at the moment. In the next slide, you'll see the breakout by race. And key message here is that immigrants in large part are racial and ethnic minorities. So again, if your work involves diversity, equity, and inclusion, this is an important group to pay attention to. You'll see in the red there that just about 35% of immigrants in California are Asian. And that largely represents people with roots in China, the Philippines, Vietnam, and India. You'll also see in the blue there that another large share, 41%, are white. And of course, we're talking about race and not ethnicity. So we haven't touched on the percentage of immigrants who are Latinx. And that percentage actually is almost 50. It's 48 to 49% in California, mainly from Central American countries and Mexico. In the next slide, you'll see a focus on children of immigrants, right? So these are young people under the age of 18 who have at least one parent who is an immigrant. And you'll see there almost half, 47.3% of the children in California have at least one immigrant parent. So they come from an immigrant family, and culture is going to be important in serving them. Language access is going to be important in serving them, as well as legal services to make sure that the family can remain together through their migration experiences. One key point here is that of the children who have immigrant parents, under 6 is roughly 42%. So if you're working in early childhood development programs, including ones like WIC or SNAP, then this group is going to be of particular interest to your work. Nationally, we think of children of immigrants as being 1 in 4. So again, you see the role that California plays in the immigrant space. Another keynote to mention about children of immigrants is that roughly a third, just under a third of children in poverty are children of immigrants. And so again, if you're working in workforce development or any kind of economic mobility programs, these children and their families are front and center. Turning now to one of the two immigrant groups to highlight for today's conversation, Afghan evacuees. So I'm sure all of us have heard from the news what's going on and how many Afghans have been evacuated to the US. They start off after being received at the airport in military bases. 8 of them to be specific, that we often refer to as safe havens. And from these military bases in Virginia, Texas, Wisconsin, New Jersey, New Mexico, and Indiana, they get resettled in different parts of the country, all across the country. Again, with California's leadership role in immigrant groups, they will, or you all will, receive the largest number of Afghan evacuees. The initial planning numbers were just over 5,000 Afghans to be resettled in California, but now we have some indication that these numbers will increase, although we don't have the final numbers. All in all, nationally, roughly 95,000 Afghan evacuees are expected to resettle from the past July into the next September. And so we'll wait to see the details of what actually happens. You'll see on the slide other select states receiving significant shares of Afghan evacuees. In that third bullet there, it speaks about the diaspora. So in the last 20 to 40 years, a lot of Afghans have been coming to the US, and their diaspora is in a few key states, and California is at the top of that list, specifically Sacramento, Alameda, and Contra Costa counties. If any of you are from there, you may already have a lot of interaction with this community. As Afghan evacuees resettle in the US, there are formal government and nonprofit, public-private relationships to create an infrastructure of services. In addition to that, the federal government, through the State Department, is rolling out a new private sponsorship program. It's actually a pilot, so it's intended to bring lessons learned with it. And through this private sponsorship pilot, which is currently in place, individuals can gather together into groups of 5 or more and apply to be a sponsor circle. If they're approved to be a sponsor circle, you might see this in your community, they will be the ones responsible for helping the families to adjust into their lives in the US, all the way from housing to getting benefits and services, enrolling in school, getting a job, and so forth, with services front-loaded in the first 3 months or 90 days. This group is in particular need of legal services for a few different reasons. One being that they receive different statuses. Some receive special immigrant visa holder status, which means they can get a green card, they have a pathway to citizenship, they can work, and so forth. Others have pending SIV applications. A third group is considered humanitarian parole, and a fourth group is refugees. Particularly individuals who are in the humanitarian parole category will need help with legal services because their parole is good for 2 years. And during that time, they will need to apply for asylum or SIV status in order to have a permanent right to stay in the US and a pathway to citizenship. I flagged an analysis done by MPI on the chart with the full link there in case anyone wants to understand these 4 categories better and the implications that they have, both for legal services and for benefits, although the CR has changed the benefits piece. Another group to highlight in the next slide is unaccompanied children. And this is a group that I believe more people are familiar with, as we have been supporting unaccompanied children for many, many years. And around 2008, the numbers started to increase. And so this population has been in the news a bit more. But just to make sure we're all on the same page about who these children are, they are kids under 18. They've crossed into the US. They don't have a parent or legal guardian or anyone that can take care of them. And they are taken into custody by the federal government. And there are several federal players involved, including different offices within the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Health and Human Services, which provides short-term care for these children until they can be released in the community. And last spring, specifically in April, we had historical highs where roughly 22,000 children were in care at one time. As children are released to parents or sponsors with the help of the federal government, they go into different local communities across the country. California and Texas typically have the most children released into their communities. In FY 2021, meaning from September to October, October to September, there were just over 9,000 children released to communities within California, largely Los Angeles and Alameda counties. And these children have a right to a public education, so they're in the schools. They may be accessing other local services as well. Of course, because these children don't have an immigration status, legal services is going to be fundamental for them. There are some pro bono legal services available, but not enough to reach all the children that are released into communities. So typically they would apply for either asylum or special immigrant juvenile status, and both of those open some doors for them in terms of permission to stay and access to services. The state of California, the Department of Social Services, has invested in legal services as well as a range of other support services for these children, beginning in 2014 and 2015. And that includes roughly $20 million to support legal service programs through nonprofit organizations, helping these youth to get access to not only asylum and SIJ status, but also U visas and T visas, often connected with human trafficking victimization. More recently, within the last year, California Department of Social Services hired a position for someone to coordinate services to these kids, the State Unaccompanied Minor Coordinator position. So that's another huge milestone. I believe California is the first in the nation to do that. So that's a lot of information I've shared. I'm happy to answer any questions or take any comments at the appropriate time, but for now, I'll hand it back over to Julia.
Excellent, thank you, appreciate that. So we have some time for question and answers. And yeah, thank you, Essie. Here's her contact info as well, in case you'd like to follow up. So yes, we'd like to take a few minutes here and see if there are any questions. Feel free to put your questions in the chat and we'll kind of work through them together and make sure that we get those answered. So give you a second to think about any questions. Also, if there's any of the other panelists on the line that would like to ask a few questions as well, feel free to. And yep, I have a request here to put her contact info back up. So here we go. And just so everyone knows, we have the settings so that we are moderating the Q&A. So we'll see your questions. So go ahead and send them to us and then we'll share them out and make sure they get answered.
Essie, I have a question. This is Sara Campos from the Grove Foundation. I'm wondering if there's any way to gauge the unmet need. You talked about people that were coming in, the need for legal services. Is there any way to determine like how much unmet need there is, like people in waiting lists or people still wanting legal services who can't get them?
Yes, absolutely. So in terms of unaccompanied children, I'll have to double check the numbers, but I believe it's only about 20% who get access to legal services. So there's a huge need. There's a huge gap right now. For Afghan evacuees, because it's a more recent event, we don't have the data to back it up, but I think it's fair to say that the large majority of Afghans arriving to the US are in that humanitarian parole group. And They are just trying to get their feet on solid ground. Housing is another major issue. Most people, I think roughly 50,000, are still in the military bases, and only about 10,000 or so have resettled in different communities. And so, legal services is kind of secondary, to be quite frank, because the basic survival needs of food, shelter, and so forth are what's most pressing now. But as service providers looking ahead, we know that in the next couple of months, beginning work on their legal assistance needs will be critical.
Great. Thank you. And we have another question in the chat here from Zellerbach from Office of, let's see, I can't quite see where you're from. There we go, Office of Immigrant Relations in Santa Clara. Or let's see, oh no, yeah, Santa Clara. The thoughts on the similarities between Afghan refugees and Haitian refugees? Any plans on relief that we can expect?
Could you repeat the question? Any plans?
Yeah. So your thoughts on the similarities between Afghan refugees and Haitian refugees, and any plans on relief that we can expect?
Okay. Yeah, that is a really, really good question. And at MPI, we've also been paying attention to the plight of Haitian migrants. And as many of you probably know, to a large degree, Haitians were repatriated back to Haiti. And there's a lot that we could go into there. But in terms of comparing the group, it can be difficult to compare such painful, traumatic experiences. Both countries have seen violence, both countries have seen poverty, both countries really struggle for stability and have been in those situations for years. I think that one key difference is that in the Afghan evacuee situation, there was a sharp moment in time, and we all saw it on the news, where immediate action was needed. And there was a lot of, we can argue to what extent it was coordinated, but there was a lot of effort from the international community to get people out. On the other hand, in the experience of Haitian migrants, there were different events, from attempted coup, natural disasters, and so forth, that made the situation more protracted. And a lot of the Haitian migrants that we saw crossing the border had actually left Haiti over a decade ago and had established lives in Southern America, Venezuela, and other countries, and migrated through that pathway from Latin America. And so there are some differences. The overwhelming message, I think, is that human suffering is the same, no matter what the details of it are, and both groups deserve the help of the United States.
Great, thank you. I've got a couple more questions here. Is there public information on the organizations that have received funding to help Afghan refugees resettle for local jurisdictions? So is there public information on those organizations?
Yes, excellent question. I'm so glad that you asked that. There's the State Department established an Afghan parole program for initial resettlement. And there is a list of all the resettlement agencies in California and the rest of the country, as well as a map. And I'd be happy later in our program to put those links in the chat, or to send them to the conveners for further distribution.
Great, thank you. And that question was from Alma Martinez in City of Fresno, so thank you for that. We have another question from Kevin Park. Many refugees did not leave with their entire families. Many have family members still looking to leave the country. So it's more of a comment, but curious if you have a reaction to that.
Yeah, it's a really important and sad reality that we're facing. And actually several resettlement agencies and those involved in this work have received questions. How do I get my family member out? Or I'm in Afghanistan, how do I get out? And fortunately, there is publicly available information about the process for requesting help from the US government, from UNHCR. And I would be happy to send links to that as well.
Great, thank you. And then Navin here asked, can you discuss the impact of California's investment in legal services on immigrant communities?
That's a great question. Unfortunately, I'm not able to answer that, but I can circle back with our partners in California Department of Social Services. Speaking more broadly at the national level, we know that over 90% of children who receive legal services have a positive immigration outcome, as opposed to those who don't receive legal services. So there is no question that providing legal services makes a life-changing difference.
Great, thank you. All right, any last questions for Essie before we move on? Feel free to type them into the chat if so, or any other comments or anything you'd like to share about kind of your experience as well related to all of this. And Alma asked if the slides can be shared with the group. We'll definitely share the slides and the recording. And then also the resources, we'll put together some additional resources like Essie was mentioning. Yes. Great, excellent. All right, well, if any other questions do pop up, definitely just put them in the chat. We'll make sure to get to them. But meanwhile, we will also move on. So we are going to take, I think, a short break. I think, at this point, I think we could actually keep moving on. How does everyone feel about continuing to move on, or should we keep our 5-minute break? Since we're running ahead of schedule, any thoughts from the speakers? Okay, let's take a very short break, just a few minutes, and then we're going to reconvene for the next part of our session here. So if you need to check an email, grab a cup of coffee, feel free to, and then we'll convene in just a few more minutes. So we'll see you back here, let's say in about 3 minutes. Okay, thank you. Okay, so we'll get started in just 1 minute if everyone wants to come back with your coffees and your emails sent. We'll keep moving in just 1 minute. Okay. Great. And I wanted to give Ivy a chance to kind of share some closing thoughts and preview the next agenda, kind of the rest of the agenda as well. So Ivy, would you like to chime in?
Sure. I just wanted to share that Essay's presentation was very powerful, both from the start through to the end. I really appreciate her statement that if you're serving people, you're serving immigrants as well. And then her closing statement as well about, you know, the stark number about how 90% of children, more than 90% of children who receive legal services have a positive outcome. How that there's no question that legal services has a makes a life-changing difference. And the fact that she was able to share specific examples of Afghan evacuees, unaccompanied minors, and even Haitian migrants as well. And so I feel like it sets a great foundation for our conversation ahead. So we're going to hear from some great speakers to list out a little bit more about the importance of legal services in the state of California.
Great. Thank you. And Essay put a lot of great links in the chat, so make sure to check those out as well. And we'll make sure that we include those in our follow-up. So thank you for that, Essay. Excellent. Okay. So yep, as you can see, the agenda that Ivy kind of outlined a little bit, we'll dive into the legal services report highlights. So some really great kind of research findings. Then we'll dive into our speaker panel, hearing from, you know, different perspectives, government, foundation, immigration policy, yeah, and others, and then small group discussions. So let's do that. And then again, just a few Zoom housekeeping rules and our ground rules, just a reminder of this as we move through the agenda as well. And so before we keep going, we want to do a poll and get a sense of who's in the room today. So Nikita is going to pop up with a Zoom poll, and so you should see this in front of you, and feel free to take a couple minutes to just fill this out. Okay, so it looks like in terms of the results, Nikita, I think I will read out the results, right? Everyone can't see them. Is that right?
They should be shared out.
Okay, can everyone see the results? So it looks like we've got a lot of local government agency folks in the room, 62%, as well as philanthropic and nonprofits. Welcome, everyone. In terms of geographic areas, a lot of folks from the Bay Area, and then a really good mix from the rest of California, and a few folks from outside of California as well. So have you worked on public-private partnerships or projects before? It looks like about 70% of folks have, which is awesome, and 30% have not. So this is new, and you'll learn a lot for everyone in the room. For government and foundations only, does your organization or agency currently fund services targeting immigrants? And it looks like 66% of you said that yes, you currently do fund, and 34% do not. And then specifically for legal services for immigrants, and it looks like 62% do currently. So that's great. Excellent. Thank you. All right, so this is great just to get a sense of who's in the room. We'll, again, have more chance to meet each other when we dive into the big breakout groups as well. So I'd like to hand it over to Navin and from the Zellerbach Family Foundation next.
Great. Excuse me. Thank you, Julia. So wonderful to see who's in the room and to see so many people investing in legal services and supporting immigrant communities. So I am to introduce us to the next session around legal services and highlights from a scan that was done in 2019, 2020. So really this convening and the planning for this convening really comes out from this report that was done, as I said, in the end of 2019, early 2020 on the capacity of legal service providers in California. And it really builds on actually another scan that was done in 2007, 2008 that was commissioned by the Zellerbach Family Foundation. And in there, during that time, I don't know if you guys remember, but that was when we thought that there might be a possibility of some kind of immigration legal reform happening nationally. And so we wanted to see then really what was the capacity of our legal services providers to really meet the demand. And so this was 2007, 2008. And overwhelmingly, we heard loud and clear that the demand really outstripped the capacity. And in fact, I believe that report, and this was only for Northern California, I believe that report said that the providers were only able to meet about 10% of the demand for legal services. And this was before any kind of big change in policy or around when we really started seeing some really huge influxes of folks, like as Essie was saying, around unaccompanied minors, or even having some of, what we have, the situation we have now with Afghanis and Haitian refugees coming into the country. So fast forward to 2019, 2020, we wanted to see if the landscape had changed, if the capacity of legal services providers had also increased with the different context. And we'll kind of go into that later with our next speaker. But, spoiler alert, even though there has been more investment, and it was really interesting just to see from the poll that there was actually substantial investment in legal services, yet the demand for legal services has continued to grow. And in some ways, this is due to, in part, that the cases have become a little bit more complicated too, and there's a huge backlog nationally around some of these cases. So cases that now are dragging on months longer, and sometimes even years longer. And so when we did the scan, when we commissioned this, we wanted to see what the opportunities were, where the pain points were too, and where we as funders, both through philanthropy and also local government, can really support the communities, because we know that legal services for immigrant communities is an essential service, that it is the pathway or the gateway to so many opportunities for folks in order to support their families, because that is the way that they get work authorization. And when you look at the demographics nationally and especially in California, it really points to just how crucial legal services are. And so what I want to do is introduce to you Allison Hamburg, who was formerly with Research Development Associates, and she was the lead on this report. I think someone is going to put a link of the report in the chat, and we'll also send this out to you with follow-up resources. I also want to mention that the report that was done in 2019-2020 obviously was done prior to COVID in this pandemic. So we know that the context has changed somewhat. And so there is conversation about doing an update to this scan that would look at possible opportunities and challenges with the pandemic, with a new administration, and just also what the opportunities and needs are for philanthropy and local government. So we can talk about that a little bit later, but I want to introduce Allison Hamburg and have her kind of get started with the highlights and recommendations from the legal services scan. Allison, take it away.
Great, thank you so much, Navin. As Navin mentioned, my name is Allison Hamburg. I am an independent consultant, and I previously worked with RDA Consulting, Resource Development Associates, which is a mission-driven consulting firm based in Oakland, where I led the Immigration Legal Services Scan. So today I'll be providing a brief overview of the project, the key findings, and the recommendations, with a focus on points relevant to public-private partnerships. Next slide, please. RDA Consulting worked with a project advisory group made up of funders and legal service providers to shape the focus of the scan, interpret data, and develop recommendations. Next, please. The goals of the project were to understand the capacity of immigration legal services in California, as Navin mentioned, to do an update to the scan that was previously conducted over 10 years prior, and to generate recommendations for strategic philanthropic investment. The primary data sources we gathered were 20 interviews with executive level staff from legal service organizations across the state, as well as 80 survey responses from immigration legal service providers. Next, please. Today, I'll provide a high-level summary of themes that came up across regions. The full report has regional highlights along with detailed regional data profiles for folks who want to take a deeper look at what were some of the common themes for different regions, since of course we know that the legal service landscape looks different across regions in California. Great. So in the area of the types and scope of legal services, the scan found that, again, as Navin said, unsurprisingly, there continues to be a high unmet need for immigration legal services. And it's important to emphasize that the need was exacerbated by, but not caused by, the policy context under the previous administration. The need was already there, and it is projected to continue. One example of survey finding is that most organizations reported that their caseloads steadily increased over the prior 3 years. Another key finding was that the services with the greatest need are also the services that are the most resource and time intensive and the least available. So this is really key. The biggest increase in need for legal services over the prior 3 years was for full representation in deportation cases, yet less than 2/3 of organizations reported providing full representation for deportation cases, and most of those organizations reported that they could meet less than half of the need for those services. And finally, the immigration policy climate really increased the need for other types of support outside of legal services, so psychosocial supports and case management, given all of the various challenges that individuals and families going through legal proceedings experienced. Next slide, please. In the area of staff training and resources, the scan found that organizations have difficulty recruiting and retaining qualified staff. And as the quote here shows, the risk of burnout is high due to a combination of secondary trauma and heavy workloads. As Navin also alluded to, the complexity of cases also means that organizations need to provide closer support to attorneys who may not be as experienced providing full representation for these complex cases. This strains organizations in terms of staffing as well as capacity for supervision. On a positive note, organizations reported that networks of providers can help coordinate referrals and share up-to-date information about changing policies with one another. Next. And finally, in the area of organizational management, organizations reported experiencing a tension between the opportunity to scale services due to there being increased funding, as well as a fear that this funding might contract in the future. And so this uncertainty was difficult for some of these legal service providers to navigate in terms of what the financial context was going to be. And we'll move on. Great. So moving on to the recommendations. To guide the development of the recommendations, the Project Advisory Committee met and discussed the key findings and really devised these recommendations in collaboration with the consulting team. To start off, the Advisory Committee set several guiding principles. The first was the value of immigration, just acknowledging that there is a value to immigration. Another is the need for bold action. And the third was around collaboration, which is shown here. So I'll discuss the recommendations, which include strategies for strengthening legal services as well as for strategic grant making. There are three categories of recommendations to strengthen the delivery of immigration legal services. These are around growing the provider pool, promoting coordination to maximize impact, and augmenting organizational capacity and wellness. So I'll just go into detail about a couple strategies and recommendations here that are relevant to public-private partnerships, and you can see the full report for more detail about all of the recommendations. Next, thank you. So recommended strategies for increasing the pipeline of qualified staff include efforts to, number one, define how work could be best divided between attorneys and DOJ accredited representatives. Also sponsoring fellowships and accreditation, and supporting high school and college students to enter the field. So there's a number of opportunities here. And next, recommendations around coordination to improve legal services really center around the idea that organizations can often accomplish more together than alone. And so several opportunities, first around expanding technology to support collaboration, as well as streamlining supervision of staff. As we noted earlier, capacity for supervising staff who are managing these complex cases is really strained. And so opportunities to provide group supervision where one organization could provide supervision for a number of other providers was a strategy that came up. And there are also opportunities to fund initiatives that promote coordinated service delivery, such as service networks, referral networks, digital information sharing among organizations, as well as collaboratives of providers. And next, thank you. So the next set of recommendations focuses on fostering responsive and collaborative grant making. Many of these recommendations, especially if you look and see the full report, you'll see they're not new in the field of philanthropy necessarily, but there are ways that they have specific relevance to the immigration legal services landscape. Thank you. So here I'll just focus in on the recommendations around collaboration again, as it relates to funding. So first is a recommendation to increase collaboration among foundations. In this realm, funders may coordinate to prioritize funding areas as well as streamline requirements for grantees, which can reduce the burden on grantees. Next, and especially pertinent to public-private partnerships, there's a recommendation to support alignment in program development and administration between philanthropy and public funders. This recommendation builds on a recognition that together, public funders, immigration legal service providers, movement and advocacy partners, and philanthropy can together advance a coordinated strategy to support immigrant families' safety and stability, and in doing so, contribute to our collective well-being. So thank you so much. I will turn it back to ILG to moderate Q&A for this portion.
Okay, thank you, Allison. That was a great presentation. So a lot of content there. I would love to hear people's questions and also share any of your own experience that maybe this is bringing up for you in the work that you've done. And so feel free to put your comments or questions in the chat, and we'll share those back out and make sure they get answered. Give people a minute to think.
Allison, I have a question with respect to technology. If you have any suggestions for how people can best maximize, the digital needs that they have as collaboratives.
Yeah, I think this is an area where further conversation with organizations, who may have tried innovative strategies, or others who may be able to help brainstorm would be helpful. We didn't go into a whole lot of depth into this area. It just was something that arose as an area of need where additional funding could be helpful to invest in solutions. This might include different technology platforms to help organizations communicate amongst one another, just making sure that organizations just have kind of the basic software necessary to collaborate and communicate digitally. And then another recommendation that came up was this would require some planning and some concerted effort, but the ability to share digitized information across legal service providers about certain cases. And of course there would need to be privacy taken into account, but a suggestion that came up was around how information could be shared across organizations to kind of streamline and reduce the burden again on the organizations.
Sara, I can add to that. This is Navin with Zellerbach again too. I think the pandemic really highlighted just how important technology is, because it really has changed the way, not only how the field looks, but how we do our work. And so for those service providers who, actually had like the basics, like laptops for their staff, accounts to Zoom, people knowing how to use Zoom and all of that was really, really important. So like having some of that, the basic needs in that way being met, but then also on the other side too, just making sure that their clients knew how to use that technology also was really a challenge. And so I think, the scan really points to thinking about like how to invest in technology, because especially now we're living in a moment where things are not going to go back to the way that it used to be. And that's challenging in some ways, but it really does also open some opportunities for us too, so that places that may not have the kinds of resources in terms of attorneys, can actually still tap into attorneys because they can now do it remotely. And so it doesn't have to be in person. So I think technology is not necessarily the silver bullet, but it is crucial to providing services in our day and age. So I'm just even just talking about baseline, but I think, what Allison's talking about too, in terms of shared resources, shared information, having like a basic intake, that everyone uses and shares would be critical in terms of just the effectiveness and efficiency of doing this work.
Great, thank you, Navin. So we've got some additional great questions here in the chat. So from Ingrid from Humboldt County, were rural areas included in the data and statistics? Are there different numbers and need in rural versus urban areas?
Yes, for sure. So we really aimed to get a broad array of different types of providers, knowing that there is such a huge difference between more urban and rural areas. And so yes, in the regional findings section, there's a lot more information about what we found, but yes, for sure, we found differences. And, I can, let's see, I have a couple of notes here. I can actually just speak to that a little bit, because I think, one thing that came out was that it wasn't so cut and dried, just that, urban areas have more resources and rural areas have less. For example, the Bay Area has, a lot of resources, a lot of organizations, has robust deportation defense services, and Bay Area organizations reported equal to greater difficulty in meeting the demand for services than other regions. speaking to, the need in more rural areas, of course, we saw that the gap, especially for deportation defense, is particularly acute in the Central Coast, Central Valley, and the Inland Empire. We also saw, of all regions, in terms of organizations responding to the survey, that organizations serving the Los Angeles region reported the lowest capacity to meet demand for full representation services. So there's some interesting nuance that came out, but yes, definitely seeing differences in resources in terms of urban and rural, especially with rural areas. There may not be as many providers located in those areas. There may be a large need to travel for providers to travel far and wide to reach clients in those areas.
Great. Can everyone hear me okay as well? I just cut out for a second, but okay, thank you. So we've got a few more here. A question here from Michelle Boyers. Given this report came out a few years ago, are there areas in terms of your recommendations where we have taken action and made some progress?
I think I might turn this one to Navin to speak to.
Yeah. Thanks for the question, Michelle. I think, so this came out early 2020. So it's really been about a year, almost 2 years. I think we are, all of these recommendations, and I think all of the issues that Allison brought up, I think are still relevant, and we're still working on that. I think for this convening, we're really thinking about public-private partnerships, and we've seen California has kind of taken the lead on some of this, and there's some opportunities around leveraging that. But I think that there's still work to be done on all of it. And this is why we wanted to bring this up, because I think that there is a role for folks in philanthropy and folks in local government to really invest and support legal services within their communities, so that we're serving the folks that are part of, the areas that we serve, and really doing right by all of Californians, right? So that's all I would say right now. I don't know if Sada or Kevin or if the folks from GCIR would want to add to that.
I'd only add that, oh, sorry, I should put myself on video. I would only add that to mention that we are working on trying to update this data, and do an update based on, the pandemic and the needs during the pandemic, as well as, a new administration that is bringing about some change and reform in the whole immigration system. So, so stay tuned to that. We're working with GCIR on updating that information, and we can, hopefully release something in early spring next year. I don't know, Kevin, if you'd like to mention more.
The only thing I would add is sort of from a bigger picture perspective, we have seen an increase in the amount and type of partnerships between state government and philanthropy to advance key initiatives. And I think that can be replicated at municipal, regional levels in the legal services context. But as you said, we'll sort of dive into that a little bit more.
Great. And I know Allison received a few questions directly. Allison, if you'd like to address those, and then we can keep moving with the others.
Yes, so one is around pay compensation. An individual from the LA County Office of Immigrant Affairs noted that sector pay is a major issue driving legal staff out of the nonprofit immigration legal services sector. Did the study include any specific findings or recommendations around compensation increases needed to retain legal staff? So yes, compensation came up very commonly in interviews, as well as the survey, as something that contributed to people leaving their positions, to burnout, and to people's ability to stay in the work. So we did not develop specific recommendations, but for sure it came up as a challenge, and so in an area needing further exploration. The other question that I got, I actually will probably turn to somebody else to answer, just because I know that other folks on the report and project advisory team have more expertise in terms of the immigration legal service area. So in assessing the capacity of legal services, did the LSC restriction on limiting representation to immigrants with lawful status come up? I'm wondering if somebody who is a bit more well-versed can speak to that.
Can you read that one more time, Allison?
Yes, and I can actually, maybe I can put it in the chat to you. Let's see, now that I just chatted it to you. LSC restriction on limiting representation to immigrants with lawful status.
I think that this is an issue that comes up a lot. And I think that because there are carve-outs, and sometimes local governments have that. And I know the California sometimes has, the California Department for Social Services also has carve-outs around this too. And we're trying to kind of address that. But I think that that's why the role of philanthropy is so important in that way, because I think philanthropy can be more nimble and flexible with their funding and not actually have those carve-outs. And so the funding legal services organizations with that kind of flexibility allows them to really serve everyone. So to be able to use a mix of different funding resources to serve the community that comes through. And so it complements, you know, while those carve-outs are not ideal, that is the reality that we're working with right now currently. And so it is useful to have funding from philanthropy or private donors that is more flexible around that to kind of complement the work so that everyone gets served, or as many people can get served as possible without having that be a barrier. So I don't know if Sara or Kevin, if you guys have other thoughts around that, but that's what I'm hearing and what I'm seeing.
I think that's right. Everything you said, there are carve-outs within the state government, but there are also carve-outs federally. You know, there's a whole network of legal services providers across the country, and the government prohibits those programs from representing undocumented people, with certain exceptions. And at some point, it looks like Swiss cheese, you know, and gets even more complex. For example, like VAWA, violence against women, folks who are eligible for those programs, for U visas, T visas, they're eligible and others are not. So, I mean, I don't believe I saw any reference to those restrictions in the report, but they're kind of what Navin referred to. They're similar in terms of limiting organizations, legal service providers, to provide services to undocumented people. So it's something that I think collectively we should all be working on, you know, as we move forward and with, you know, new administration, new reforms.
Great, thank you. Allison, did you have any other direct questions for you?
Yes, just got one more. Did the survey also delve into how funding should be structured to have the most impact or be sustainable for nonprofits? For example, cost per service versus reimbursement for attorney and staff time. So I recall that this did come up and that there were discussions about this. At the moment, my mind is not drawing specific information in terms of where that shows up in the report or if we had recommendations around it, but it is definitely something that came up in the discussion. So again, I'm not sure if Navin or Sara would like to speak to that a bit.
Yeah, I mean, overwhelmingly, we heard from the folks on the ground that funding on like a per case basis didn't necessarily work, specifically because those cases were taking so long and they were so complicated. So you would have all these different motions having to be filed for one case. And so one case would turn into 6 cases. And so it just didn't, that didn't represent like the full cost of doing that work. And so one of, the recommendation generally was to really think about the full cost of doing this work. Also, partners really wanted general operating support, right? So it was not just tied to like a program. And we hear that just generally from nonprofit providers, that gives them the flexibility to kind of do that work. And then, really also thinking about inflation too. As a foundation, we're guilty of this too, where we keep our grant sizes pretty much the same year after year without taking that into account. And that has bearing on the previous question around pay and compensation for workers too. So like if you're not able to, if you do not see an increase in your grants and investments to your work, how can you increase pay for your staff? How can you really take into account what it actually costs to do this work and to provide like really holistic services to your clients and support your staff holistically too. Because we're also hearing, Allison mentioned this a little bit too, just that not only are we dealing with the trauma from the clients that are coming in talking about the needs that they have and having to provide safety net and also just case management to those clients, but that the staff themselves are also traumatized by the stories that they're hearing too. And if you can imagine doing this work year after year, just the emotional and mental impacts it has on you. And so just having the resources really to try to address that and to support staff better was really critical and key. I'll turn it over to Sada if you want to add anything to that. And I think that Allison found the recommendations around that so she can share a little bit more too.
I can just jump in. So yes, hearkening back since, again, this report was conducted a couple years ago, so I have to remember everything that was in it. But yes, there is a whole set of recommendations around aligning funding to organizational needs, as Navin was just saying, alignment with the true costs, operational capacity funding, multi-year grants, and then specific to legal services, considering alternative funding structures for legal caseloads. So offering different strategies, such as funding by total number of cases open at one time, or funding by hour, or by position. So just, the report doesn't necessarily recommend it should be a certain way, but just noting that alternative funding structures are important to explore. And then again, as Navin was just talking about, there is a set of recommendations around health and wellness strategies for staff, recognizing the impact of secondary trauma, morale, as well as the traditionally low compensation for these positions.
Thank you. We've got a few more questions in the chat here that I want to share and make sure get answered. I think some of this has been addressed already as well. First here is that from Alma Martinez, City of Fresno. Can you please share details on those consulted for the report? Were these nonprofit legal service agencies, pro bono services from private attorneys, or others?
Yes, so it was a mix, and the report includes the list of all organizations that participated in the interviews as well as the survey. I would say a large proportion were nonprofit legal service providers, but there were also a number of other types of providers.
Okay. Great. And then let's see, we've got a comment here from Nahir Torres. I really appreciate the infrastructure recommendations, like having an anchor take responsibility for supervision across collaborative partners. This seems like a creative way of streamlining PD and capacity building. And then we've got another question here. I think we touched on this already, but if there's anything else people want to share. From Daniel Sharp, LA County Office of Immigrant Affairs, sector pay is a major issue driving legal staff out of the nonprofit sector. Did the study include any specific findings, recommendations regarding compensation increases needed to retain experienced legal staff?
Yes, Daniel Sharp's, that was the same question that I received. So
oh, okay.
Yeah, so we spoke to that.
Great. Yeah.
Yes.
And I've got one more here as well. From Celica, Office of Immigration Relations in Santa Clara County. Did you find partners who talked about capacity building in community, doing community education doc collection and or application assistance, specifically leveraging promoter models to support with application prep? And if we maybe want to hear from Celica, unless you understand that question entirely, we could also get some clarification.
Let's see. So I can speak a little bit to that. We included a whole range of legal service types in the report. And so we did look at services that are around information and referral and application assistance. And so, I can't remember if, a promotora model came up specifically, but we do have information, and it was included in the survey, whether individuals or whether the organizations provide information referral and application assistance. Yeah, so again, if Navin or Sada want to speak to that, I invite you to as well.
I don't think I have anything to add with respect to that question.
Yeah, and we can also take it offline too if you want to talk about this a little bit more too. Just to please reach out to one of us, and we're happy to have a conversation around that.
And let's see, it looks like I have one message actually just requesting that maybe we could go into gallery view and take off the screen sharing just so that we can see each other at the moment.
Sure.
And then another question, were there best practices that the report captured? So yes, I would say the short answer is yes. There were areas where we would include examples that we heard through interviews or through the survey about ways that organizations had kind of devised to face some of the challenges that the field faces. For example, there was some discussion around response networks, one I believe in the San Diego area. And so throughout the report, there are references to either some best practices or innovative practices. There's not like a full section kind of talking about best practices, but it's kind of interspersed throughout.
Thank you. And then I shared with everyone the chat from Cristina Dos Santos in East Palo Alto. So a really good example of kind of just some of the experiences of a service provider on the ground with the kind of ballooning caseloads and burnout of staff. So thank you for sharing that as well. And I think that's it. Any other questions people are seeing on their end? Great, thank you everyone. Really good questions, really good discussion. I appreciate it. So let me share my screen one more time and we'll move on here. Okay. Great, so I'm going to hand it over to Sara Campos from Grove Foundation. And so this next portion is about the public-private partnership speaker panels and really diving into specific examples. So Sara, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Julia. And So as Julia said, we're going to be talking about public-private partnerships. And as we heard earlier, and we'll probably hear again throughout this forum, there's tremendous need for legal services in immigrant communities throughout the state. We have populations of Afghanis, unaccompanied immigrant children, Haitians were mentioned earlier, and not to mention the immigrants that have been in this state waiting on the sidelines for some sort of pathway to citizenship. And one of the ways that we can address some of this need is to follow the recommendations of this report, which is basically to maximize impact by collaborating. There's enormous power in working together to provide for those needs. So, but for the moment, I'd like to just highlight San Mateo County and something that a public-private partnership example that we have locally. San Mateo County is an affluent county. It's one of the wealthiest counties in the country. It's also a county that has one of the highest income disparities in the US. But about 7% of the county resides in poverty, and about 6% of the population is estimated to be undocumented. And within that population, there's a large proportion of working families with young children. As we know, during the pandemic, the federal government provided for people who were in need through the CARES Act. But even though immigrants, were engaged in essential services, often harvesting food and doing medical services and other, services for people, undocumented immigrants were not eligible to receive any relief. More than 1 in 3 immigrant households in San Mateo County had no income at the height of the pandemic. And as we later saw, immigrants bore the brunt, along with other populations, of course, in terms of illness and hospitalization and so forth with respect to COVID. Following the lead of the state, San Mateo County created a partnership between philanthropy, county officials, and nonprofits to provide relief for immigrant families. And they started out with $100,000. But between philanthropy and the county, the partnership raised $16 million for needy families in San Mateo County. $4 million came from the county, and $12 million was raised by philanthropy. So the partnership gave out 58,000 cash grants to immigrants who were in need, so that 1 out of every 2 undocumented immigrants in the county received $1,000 checks. So as you listen to the presenters on this program, I'd urge you to think about the needs in your own communities and consider where are the possibilities for increased collaboration. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Kevin, who will introduce our speakers.
Thank you for sharing that, Sara, and thank you to everyone for being with us for today's conversation. I'm actually really excited for the next part of the dialogue because we're going to have an opportunity here from folks who've actually put these ideas and theories to work. And so we are really lucky to be joined by 3 speakers today who are going to be offering perspectives from a couple different stakeholder point of views. First, we're going to hear from Sally Kinoshita, the Deputy Director of the Immigrant Legal Resource Center. That will be followed by Nora Presido, the Director of Mayor Eric Garcetti's Office of Immigrant Affairs in Los Angeles. And then finally, Ali Saidi, the Deputy Public Defender and Immigration Attorney at the Contra Costa County Public Defender's Office. So we're going to have a nice mix of community and government perspective here in terms of what it has looked like to actually work together to implement legal services programs for community. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Sally, who's going to open us up here.
Thank you so much, Kevin, and good morning, everyone. Again, my name is Sally. I'm the Deputy Director at the Immigrant Legal Resource Center, also known as the ILRC. I use the pronouns she, her. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Immigrant Legal Resource Center, we are a national nonprofit organization headquartered in San Francisco, and we lead and participate in multiple legal services collaborations to meet the needs of immigrants. Our mission is to work with and educate immigrants, community organizations, and the legal sector to continue to build a democratic society that values diversity and the rights of all people. And I want to thank you so much for having me today and for having this conversation in general. I spent this morning so far taking notes furiously on all the fantastic information that was shared, as well as some of the questions that came up. I will try to address some of the questions and incorporate some of that information into what I share today. I was so pleased to see that the majority of you do support immigrant services for immigrants, immigration legal services. But for those of you who are newer to this, I'll do a little level setting by first covering a little bit about the legal services needs of immigrants. I think it goes without saying that the issue of status for immigrants is of great importance, not only for immigrants and their families, but for the state of California in general. Estimates are that nationally, there are about 11 million undocumented immigrants in the United States, about a quarter of whom are here in our state of California. For undocumented people, the ability to get some kind of protection through some of the conversations or discussions that are happening in Congress or other administrative options, it could mean protection from deportation. They're talking about access to work permits or what's called employment authorization, and with it, the right to work, access to the banking and credit systems, driver's licenses in states. For those who are able to get a green card, it opens up opportunities to, of course, work and stay in the country legally, petition other family members to get green cards, to travel in and out of the United States, and to be on a pathway to citizenship. For immigrants who already have a green card, the ability to become a US citizen, of course, unlocks the potential for full civic participation through voting, the ability to access more jobs, as well as the ability to petition even more family members to come to the United States. Immigration law is incredibly complex. There are not very many avenues for undocumented immigrants to regularize, legalize, or stabilize their status to get something that would give them a work permit or a green card, which is why we have so many undocumented immigrants in the United States. So there aren't many avenues, and it's very complex. As Essie shared with us earlier today, there are different options for Afghan refugees, for unaccompanied minors, for other individuals. The options can be very particular to specific situations, specific laws, etc. Even so, when immigration options do become available, legal services are very time consuming. And as we've heard throughout today, there are not enough attorneys or legal services providers to those who are currently eligible for an immigration option. And certainly we do not have enough services available if new programs become available. Just to reiterate, as Essie shared, her estimates that she shared were maybe 20% of immigrants currently have access to legal services, and it's life-changing when they do have that access. As she shared, 90% of children who receive legal services saw a positive result, so it can be incredibly life-changing. I also want to share that even under Democratic administrations, deportation and detention always remain a risk. It's not only about who's in office as our president. We have an immigration system that is built around enforcement. We've had decades of policy and legislative changes that have really made our immigration system into one that's very punitive, that makes it very risky for immigrants and their families here in the United States to remain here stably and together. And also, we haven't had a major legalization program, meaning a benefits program that allows people here without status to get status. We haven't had a major benefits program like that since the 1980s. In the meantime, we've had multiple changes that have made our system far more punitive, regardless, as I said, of who's in office. So immigration law and policy are constantly changing. There are many discussions currently in Congress right now where, as advocates, our hope was that there might be something that would come out of a legislative process that would create a pathway to citizenship for 11 million undocumented immigrants. If for anyone who's following the news, that's looking like less and less possible, and yet the conversation continues because there might be other kinds of options that would benefit other, specific populations of the undocumented population. So conversations continue about a registry program or a parole program that would minimally provide perhaps work authorization to certain populations, possibly defined as dreamers or temporary protected status TPS holders, farm workers. There may be options that will pass for certain specific populations. It may not lead to a full pathway to citizenship. However, I do want to highlight that the last kind of benefits program that we saw that affected many people was DACA in 2012. I think many people here are familiar with DACA. Estimates were that that only would benefit maybe 1.2 million. These other possibilities that are still being discussed would benefit many more than that amount. And we saw even with DACA, the effort and the mobilization of services was massive. So any of these other kinds of programs will similarly need a massive effort that will require public-private partnership across communities, across regions, et cetera. So we really appreciate that you all are participating in this conversation because of the kind of coordination that will be required. I also want to mention that some estimates are that of the existing undocumented population, it's possible that 10 to 20% are eligible or could be eligible in the future for one of the existing immigration options. And so even with our existing policies and laws in place, even if there's no new policy or law that's passed, that there may be millions of people in the United States who could be eligible for some existing benefit program if they were screened and assisted with that. Almost any, just to give you a little sense of what that looks like for legal services and what the need might be, almost any proposal for a legalization program or one of these sort of secondary to us choices of a parole or registry, as well as our existing naturalization program to get US citizenship, almost any of these programs will require the need to prove residence in the United States over a certain number of years, perhaps many years, 10 or more. Presence in the United States, perhaps on a specific or certain date. Almost any proposal will have bars to eligibility for people with certain criminal records. All of these processes now cost a lot of money. The proposals for any new program are perhaps thousands of dollars to even apply. And any of these programs require a legal analysis to determine eligibility, how someone can show that they're eligible, as well as analysis of what the risk is of applying, and if they're actually triggering a heightened risk of detention or deportation simply by applying. So what do those kinds of requirements require? Well, legal services and attorneys to do the legal screening and analysis and final review of applications before submission. Assistance accessing and gathering the necessary evidentiary documents, including identity documents, documents that perhaps show a relationship to another family member, qualifying documents to show presence and residence in the United States. Depending on the program, they may need help accessing documents to show education in the United States, employment, or other kinds of qualifying evidence. Also, I mentioned that there's almost certainly going to be some kind of criminal bars, in other words, bars to eligibility for folks with a criminal record. So here in California, we do have a number of what are called post-conviction relief options, where people can ameliorate their criminal records or certain criminal records in a way that would actually put them back into being eligible for some of these immigration options. So that kind of post-conviction relief is also critical, and assistance for that. Also, assistance with the filing fee amounts, access to loans, filing fee assistance, savings programs, in ways that actually also might help build, might create credit building opportunities for immigrant families. People will need assistance gathering past immigration records through a Freedom of Information Act or FOIA request. There's going to be a need for education and outreach from trusted key officials about these programs, to let people know if and when they're safe to apply, to encourage them to apply, to let them know where to find help, and to direct them to competent and reliable legal services providers. As a side note, during the early DACA days, there was one focus group where the immigrant community was asked about who they would trust about DACA. And, what about really bringing in certain celebrities or well-known members of the immigrant community to encourage them to apply? And some of the responses were like, why would someone who themselves is an immigrant like me know any better than me about whether or not this program is real? I want to hear from someone from the government that this is a real program and is actually in place. So just a note for municipal leaders that sometimes those are the key leaders and spokespersons that can convince some people to participate. Also, any potential program unfortunately brings out unscrupulous notarios, unscrupulous attorneys, and other bad actors who will seek to prey upon the immigrant community, create false hopes and expectations in exchange for their money. And so also there's going to be a real need to let people know to watch out, to be good consumers of legal services, and to know that there are sometimes bad actors, and that they need to know where the trusted legal services providers are. And again, just ongoing know your rights information for those who may still be at risk of ICE enforcement, detention, and deportation. We're fortunate in California to have a strong network of philanthropy, nonprofit legal services providers, and community-based organizations. But the need, as everyone has said, is still really great. And I want to kind of address some of that need, as well as some of the issues that came up earlier today. One is that it's no surprise to anyone to hear how diverse the state of California is in terms of ethnicity, language, employment, geographic diversity. So the need for bilingual and bicultural services is huge. The Immigrant Legal Resource Center about a week and a half ago just did a webinar specifically on the needs of indigenous migrants. We're talking about the many migrants from south of the border, Central America and Mexico, who come from indigenous communities, are not Spanish speaking, despite the fact that they may have immigrated or migrated from Mexico, Guatemala, etc. And the real need to provide those services in Canjoal, in Mixteco, and other languages. One thing that is unique to immigration law, and we're very fortunate to have, is the ability to provide legal services through people who are not licensed attorneys. So in immigration law, we have something called the Department of Justice Recognition and Accreditation Program, which allows nonprofit organizations to be recognized by the Department of Justice to provide legal services, and have staff that are trained as accredited representatives to provide services similar to attorneys without actually having gone to law school or taken a bar exam. This is an incredible opportunity to support bilingual, bicultural legal services providers, even short of them having gone to law school, and could be a critical way to provide those kinds of bicultural, bilingual services to some of these communities that for whom there aren't a lot of existing services. Those kinds of bicultural, bilingual services are also going to be critical for what someone had brought up before, promotoras, community navigators. These are critical pieces of the network where individuals can provide the education and outreach to community members to let them know about these programs, and again, to direct them to competent services. Community navigators can be a piece of the puzzle to help people find and access and gather those documents to show eligibility. And again, it's not just the biliteracy, it's also the biculturalism among some of our not only indigenous migrants with sort of language minorities, not Spanish, other kinds of languages that aren't as common, also some of our Southeast Asian community and others. We encounter not only languages that aren't as traditionally provided through the legal services organizations, but also different rates of literacy, different sense of time and timekeeping, all sorts of issues that can actually create additional challenges and barriers sometimes for our community members to access services. I also wanted to mention there have been questions about the state services and reimbursement rates, et cetera. Here in California, we are really fortunate that our state legislature has invested in immigration services through the California Department of Social Services. It's $45 million or more per year at this point. One thing about these legal services is that to be eligible to get the funding, a nonprofit organization has to have at least 3 years of experience providing that kind of service. And so one way that philanthropy and local governments can help support this effort is actually helping in the capacity building of nonprofit organizations to start doing that work so that after 3 years, they could also access the state funding. One issue we have in the state of California is that some of the organizations with whom we work that provide services to some of the underserved communities don't have that kind of experience or 3 years of experience yet. And so we have an opportunity to leverage the state funding by supporting organizations, by creating even a pipeline to state and other funding that has existing kind of eligibility requirements. There was also a question about sort of the rates of reimbursement versus a model of supporting general support or attorney salaries. We're fortunate again that in the state of California, there are enough services that there are a lot of different data points around this. The state of California does have a reimbursement rate, a kind of fee for service rate. Those were based initially on a survey of the field back in, I believe, 2015. I know there are others on this in this meeting who probably would remember the exact year, but as you can imagine, it was at least 2015. In the ensuing 6 years, the cost of everything has gone up since then, as well as the complexity of these cases and the amount of time they take, partly because of the shifting threats under the Trump administration and new policies under the Trump administration, as well as all the ensuing litigation that made things really go back and forth for how long a case would take, what the options were. Two other things I wanted to mention briefly, and then I'll wrap it up. One is there was a question about LSC funded organizations. LSC is an acronym for the Legal Services Corporation. That is federal funding for nonprofit legal services. That federal funding decades ago restricted the ability of legal services to provide services to immigrants without status. And as people have mentioned, there are some exceptions to that. But for the most part, what that meant is that over the decades that followed, many traditional legal services, some organizations that have legal aid or legal aid society or legal services in their title and others, actually just moved away from immigration services altogether because they couldn't provide legal services to immigrants for the most part, so they just didn't provide immigration legal services providers. We've seen a little bit of a readjustment where some of those LSC funded organizations do now provide legal services, immigration legal services, but none of them can provide full scope immigration legal services, and many of them provide very limited legal services. So when we see any big benefit program on the horizon, and our hope is to include those LSC funded organizations in the effort, if there is an exception that allows them to participate, for example, in a legalization program, there will be a big need to provide extra support to organizations like that to build that capacity. We can't assume they already have it built into their program. And finally, I just want to mention something about trauma that was brought up earlier. Some of you may be familiar with the term secondary trauma that our legal services providers sometimes experience by working with traumatized clients. They feel that trauma as well as a secondary trauma. Just to let you know how deep that trauma can be felt, we heard from USCIS, Citizenship and Immigration Services, the benefits adjudicating agency, that when it comes to U visa cases, U visas are for victims of crime, the Violence Against Women Act cases, those are for family members who've been abused by a US citizen or a green card holder. Even those adjudicating officers, they rotate them out of that unit in adjudicating those cases because they suffer something called tertiary trauma. Even just reading about the cases, not even meeting any clients or community members face to face, not hearing their story directly, just reading about it through their applications is so traumatizing to them that they realize they have to rotate those adjudicators out of those cases every so often. So I know we have a lot of other great speakers, and I'm be here for questions as well, but I'll end it here and want to again thank you so much for being part of today's conversation and for considering partnering on any of these efforts. Thanks, Kevin.
Thank you so much, Sally. This was so good. I was like typing notes as you were talking, and I'm sure lots of folks were as well. So just a reminder, we are going to have time for question and answer following these presentations. So if you have questions, go ahead and drop them in the chat. I just want to name a couple of quick things that I heard you mention that felt really important before I move to our next speaker. One was just really looking at the existing need that is already out there, regardless of whether or if we're able to get any sort of additional relief. Some of the most recent numbers, I think there's 1.5 million in the state of California would be eligible if the parole option were to go through. And so it's a really important wake-up call to get that infrastructure in place if we should be so lucky to get the additional capacity. You also talked about the fact that people need help determining their eligibility. And I think it's important to underscore for everyone that's not just the people who are eligible are going to walk in and ask for support to determine eligibility. Everyone's going to walk in and want to know if they're eligible or not. So it's just even more strain and demand on the system for capacity. And then finally, your point around sort of the 3-year requirement of experience to access state funding, that was such an important point because that's a very concrete way for philanthropy and government to leverage its dollars by investing in those community groups, let them get the experience, then tap into that much broader pot of public funding. So thank you for all of those important lessons. Now I want to pivot to Nora Presido from Mayor Garcetti's office, who I think many of us are familiar with. I'm very glad to have you on today's program. And you're going to be able to share with us a little bit about some of examples of actual partnership between philanthropy and community and government. So no, we're looking forward to that. So I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, everybody, for the invitation to be here. And again, Nora Preciado, I'm the director of Mayor Garcetti's Office of Immigrant Affairs here in LA. Our mission is quite simple, to promote and advance the economic, cultural, social, and political well-being of immigrant and refugee communities here in our city. And we do this by developing programs and initiatives that support them and their families in that integration, whether it's through coordinating city services, through outreach efforts to disseminate important information, and doing some legislative advocacy. As you all know, Mayor Garcetti is a huge supporter of ensuring that our immigrant Angelenos are thriving in the city. As part of my work, we have to be very strategic and work very collaboratively to ensure that we are being responsive to the needs of our immigrant and refugee Angelenos. The ongoing need to add capacity, as everyone has shared this morning, to our immigration legal services CBOs here in LA, and to protect the due process rights of those facing immigration removal proceedings is one issue that we are tackling in this very collaborative way. And I do want to just mention that we have some of my colleagues from the county who are partners in this work on this webinar as well. Next slide, please. Just a quick snapshot of our immigrants here in LA. So first, in just the larger metropolitan area, there are approximately 4.4 million immigrants in the LA metro area, and about half of them are naturalized citizens, and another 2.2 million are potentially at risk of deportation. In the city of LA itself, it is home to over 1.5 million immigrants out of over 4 million residents. And that means that we have about 38% of our city's population that happen to be immigrants. And nearly 2 out of every 3 of our Angelenos are either immigrants or the children of immigrants. Next slide, please. And I do want to touch a little bit on sort of the economic contributions of immigrants to the city of LA, but by no means do I want to portray or send the message that it is because of their economic contribution that we're trying to prioritize their well-being. But I think for localities, sometimes at City Hall and many other places where some of the city colleagues work, we live and die by the numbers. And so I think it is important to, aside from knowing that it's a moral obligation and imperative to make sure that they're taken care of, but they are a big part of our cities and the reason why we are able or not to thrive. Here in the city of LA, immigrants are definitely the engine of our economy. They represent 47% of the workforce and more than half of the self-employed workforce. So entrepreneurship is huge in the city of LA. Many immigrant-owned businesses, and it's generated about $3.5 billion in income in the last few years. We have the latest data we have, although we're going to come out with some new data very soon. In 2014, foreign-born residents contributed $6.9 billion in federal taxes and $3.2 billion in state and local taxes. Our Angeleno immigrants are definitely a fundamental pillar of our city across all of our sectors, right? From our educational institutions to our artistic stages, to our essential workers, the halls of government, our community activists, and therefore it is a priority of Mayor Garcetti and the city of LA to ensure their safety and stability. So with that background in mind, next slide, please. I want to talk to you today about the LA Justice Fund and our experience here in one of this private-public partnerships. The LA Justice Fund is a public-private partnership that was established in 2017 between the County of LA, the City of LA, the California Community Foundation, and the Weingart Foundation. This was an unprecedented partnership. It was established to assist immigrants with legal representation services, especially those that cannot afford legal assistance. And we've all seen the studies about what a difference it makes to have a lawyer represent you during removal proceedings. And so this partnership and the LA Justice Fund has been really at the forefront of providing legal representation to immigrants in the county who are in fact detained or in removal proceedings. In 2017, the initial investment for the first 2 years of the pilot program was $7.9 million in city, county, and philanthropic dollars. Then there were an additional $4 million, one per entity, that sustained it through some bridge funding while we figured out what is the next iteration of this program. How does it need to evolve to continue to be responsive to the needs of communities? To date, there's been an investment total of $11.6 million. And so that's a significant investment in this area. The Justice Fund provided grants to 17 organizations to both provide legal assistance, like I mentioned, to immigrants, and to a number of those organizations to provide technical assistance, training, and support in ramping up of capacity. And this is something that's been mentioned throughout. It isn't just about funding legal services, but having the vision of how do you ramp up capacity in a short, medium, and long-term way in your area, right? So it has to be both of those things in order for this to work. And there's still a lot of work that needs to happen in order to do that long-term. I know some of you mentioned, some of the presenters mentioned some ideas on how to do that. Some of the organizations that we fund include many of the, the CBOs in our area that have been doing this work for a long time. But for some, this may have been sort of the first entry into some of the removal proceedings, needing to staff up, ramp up capacity, learn, train, etc. As of January, I'm going to give you some numbers, but please don't get stuck on the numbers, and I'll talk about that why in a minute. As of January 2021, the LA Justice Fund has conducted about 2,047 legal services screenings and provided representation for 568 individuals. And throughout the pilot phase, completed about 90 cases with 60% of the clients cases resulting in a positive outcome. So you can see, again, that the numbers bear out that it makes a difference to have legal representation in this proceeding. Next slide, please. And so I'm going to touch a little bit on the benefits of a public-private partnership. Why does it make sense to do this? There's a number of reasons, and again, my colleagues from county may also have additional ones, but I think we agree on this view. One, it's a way to demonstrate a local commitment and live out our values, right? So funding immigration services and removal defense and other types of legal services is a value statement by our local governments. Aside from, again, as I mentioned in the beginning, I believe very deeply as an immigrant myself, it is our moral obligation to protect vulnerable populations. And there is no one more vulnerable than somebody who has been plucked out of their home, out of their family in an immigration detention center, waiting to be banished forever from family, community, in this country. It's a very important signal to have a local government invest, right? It's an important signal to our immigrant communities. For us, for the city of LA, the mayor has been working very hard throughout both of his terms to make sure that we are in fact a welcoming city and that we protect the rights of every Angelino, including the due process rights of immigrants. Another reason why there's a benefit to this partnership is the leveraging of resources, and we've heard that throughout today. Leveraging public-private dollars is a very good way to maximize impact. I just talked about the investment in this work. We would not be able, the city alone, philanthropy alone, or the county alone, be able to have the impact that $11.6 million so far have had on the ground. And so it becomes this shared effort and responsibility. And again, we've heard about the need. We've heard about the need to ramp up capacity locally in our legal services providers. We heard about the maybe upcoming need for even more legal services provision, right? If there is any path to citizenship or anything else that becomes available through legislation or otherwise, a more sizable investment is crucial since the need will continue to be great. In terms of leveraging resources, funding from various sources can also allow for faster response to evolving needs. There are constant shifts of policy at the federal level, and having to keep up with them and be nimble is important. The GCIR report notes the complex federal immigration enforcement system, and as you've seen, it can shift under a same administration. It shifts when there is a change in administration, and so there's a need to, again, just remain nimble and be able to shift priorities and resources. We wanted a local program that can adapt in response to those changes, and funding from multiple sources facilitates that prompt response. Another reason why leveraging those dollars is important is philanthropy dollars help fill gaps where public funds can't, and can be a catalytic to launching these types of programs, exactly like it happened here in LA. Having a comprehensive framework opens the door to also attracting additional dollars to support specific program components of populations. And also, as you mentioned, there are new populations that are coming into our localities, and so making sure that we are able to shift some of those funds and philanthropy dollars tend to be a little more flexible in that way. Not to mention that having the investment by city, county, and philanthropy also is attractive to state and federal funding, right? Whenever that's available. And then, for LA, the city of LA, we look at this as a safety net issue. Any investment, any leveraging of these resources, we think of it as we are expanding our safety net, right? And in the long term, for us, it translates into save municipal dollars, actually, because each individual that you're able to support means another family that is stabilized, which turns into full communities being more stable and able to thrive. And so that benefits everyone in the city, not just that one individual or that one case that you talk about when we talk about the numbers, right? The impact is just wider than that. This regional approach also makes sense in this collaboration. For the city of LA, we're only one of 88 cities in the county, so we need this regional approach. But also, again, having this locally tailored program that can focus on addressing local needs and gaps is helpful. And increased efficiency and flexibility, as I mentioned, the funding flexibility, the different sources is very helpful to us. Philanthropic funding, again, being most flexible. The locally generated funds are the next most flexible. And then there's others that we continue to kind of look to see if we can tap into, like ARP dollars and others, but that may have more restrictions on how they can be used. Next slide, please. So those are some of the benefits. I want to provide a little bit of on the fundraising end. And again, this is not a full picture, just kind of a snapshot. If you have questions, happy to follow up too. At the beginning of the program, the pilot program, and now as we expand the fund, fundraising has been really important to, again, maximize that impact. When the pilot was starting to become an idea and become more a reality, the partners hosted webinars to increase awareness and the potential to maximize the investments. They also hosted funders briefings to highlight the partnership to share, local information, research findings, and any opportunities to collaborate. And now, as we move into revamping the Justice Fund into its next iteration, a few things that we're keeping in mind include the need to diversify our funding sources. So for the City of LA, the money for the Justice Fund comes from our general funds, but we did and continue to explore different other pots of money that could be earmarked towards this. In this last fiscal year, the investment from the city doubled from $1 million to $2 million. And so again, we just continue to seek new ways to diversify funding. The county, same. I think they are trying to explore holding in funding from other sources internally, because again, as we expand the program and it's responsive to different needs, there may be more opportunities to align funding into this program. And again, seeking additional philanthropic dollars, just given the importance of that flexibility. We're also getting creative about other sources, right? Exploring whether ARP dollars, any local measures, and any other dedicated sources could be allocated here. Sometimes we don't think about, an unaccompanied children's shelter program may have pieces of it that belong in this program. There may be other homelessness prevention and other programs that may have a component that fits with it. How do we, again, pool funding and maximize that impact? And then leveraging other resources, right? State and federal dollars. Here in California, we're very lucky that there is a state investment into this type of work. And so funding for some of these programs may exist to a certain extent. And so being part of that pool of money with some dedicated LA specific money helps as well. And finally, what we're doing is, I think that in this next iteration, what's being proposed now in the county and hopefully soon in the city is providing an attractive framework for the future of this program, that meaning it has been key to take a step back and begin to create a framework that makes sense in the current reality, that captures the different pieces to fill in the gaps in the need, but that also allows many different funders to find something in particular they want to contribute to because they believe in the whole, right? So that's those are some things about where this is going. And then next slide, please. And then I'll just take a minute to share some lessons learned from the LA experience. And again, this is mostly mine and from the city lens. And somebody mentioned this, asked that in a question, defining outcomes and success. And I think both for philanthropy, that's sometimes a challenge, but also for localities, right? We are used to thinking about programs sometimes in terms of numbers people served, et cetera, but that may be a very narrow view of, again, the actual impact of a program and a holistic approach and a holistic impact that a program like this is having in our communities, in our cities. And so again, finding more creative ways to think about this, more holistic ways to capture what is really the effect and the impact of a program like this. So the numbers may not tell the whole story, and making sure that we are doing it justice, right? When we talk about what has been done with those city dollars or county dollars or philanthropy dollars. And that goes to for the burden that is placed on the providers themselves, right? So again, to think about that. And it's kind of a segue into the next point, which is one of the lessons learned is the appropriate data collection, making sure that you're giving localities what they need, right? But also avoiding a burden and inefficiencies by asking too much of providers. We've all heard this morning too that they are at capacity. They are working very hard, and we want to make this as efficient for both sides as possible. So same, this goes for localities and for philanthropy, just the need to make sure that the data collection that's being imposed, one, is funded, two, that it's realistic, and three, that it's not placing an undue burden on the providers. Last, having some flexibility has been important, a lesson learned in this, continually assessing the changing landscape and responding to that. And I think that goes with this long-term vision, like what are we building towards, investing in capacity building, not just the provision of services. As has been mentioned, investing in capacity building in the sense of not just adding staff, but also how do you support burnout? How do you support things like cultural competency and the ability to provide services in language and all those other things that come with really doing this work in an intentional, strategic way for our CBO partners. So those are just some thoughts on the LA Justice Fund experience, and I'll stop there, but I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Nora. That was wonderful. And while we have familiarity at GCIR with this project, it's always exciting to just kind of hear again about like the tremendous success you guys have been able to leverage down there with your partners. And I'll just name again a few key things that I heard from your remarks before we move on. The first one is really just this idea of these partnerships being greater than the sum of their parts. Two different foundations, a county government and a city government working together, obviously we're able to achieve really impressive outcomes that no one of them could have done by themselves. So thank you for lifting up this example. Another thing that I appreciate that you talked about was the fact that supporting immigrant families was a good goal in and of itself, but it also redounded to the community in terms of supporting the overall community stability as each family itself is stabilized through this work, and really looking to sort of the holistic impacts of supporting community. And the last thing I would sort of lift up, you talked about the ability for philanthropy to fill gaps, but I think the important takeaway there is that philanthropy can better fill those gaps when it has the opportunity to proactively plan with government around what those gaps are going to be and what they can look like. So if a county or municipal government knows they can fund X, Y, or Z, but they can't do these portions, there can be proactive work done together to really make the investments go further than sort of scrambling after the fact to sort of see what those gaps are. And then finally, both you and Sally and some of our earlier presenters talked about this issue of burnout on staff. And so I just want to name that this is an area of work that GCIR's been looking at for some time. And we've also done a research study report on secondary trauma facing immigrant service providers. And we can share a link to that report in the follow-up to this conversation for those who want to learn more about how philanthropy and government can support that. So thank you again for your remarks. We'll definitely get some questions for you as well. And now I want to transition to our final speaker, Ali Saidi, Deputy Public Defender at the Contra Costa Public Defender's Office. And I know you also have some other responsibilities even beyond this long title. So I'd invite you to share a little bit about sort of your role and then dive into your remarks.
Thank you, Kevin. I appreciate that. And thank you everyone for being a part of this important conversation. As Kevin mentioned, my name is Ali Saidi. I am the director of Contra Costa County's kind of immigration collaborative called Stand Together Contra Costa. I have to tell you just before we get started, I myself am an immigrant, so this work is very, very personal to me. But I also am an attorney, so I talk fast and I talk a lot. So I'm going to try to keep it as succinct and clear as possible, but I'm looking forward to any questions you might have. So this is really exciting, right? Why a collaborative? And to me, I think, the first question for us was, in my case, I was working on at the Public Defender's Office as our house immigration specialist, and seeing time and time again access to competent, successful advice and services, and so I always knew that was an issue for us. In my past life, I had been a private removal defense attorney myself, and a public defender doing criminal defense work. And so, the question from the county level, because Nora really addressed so many of the important issues on why collaboratives make sense, public-private partnerships between philanthropy and the public sector. I wanted to say from both a county level and from the public defender's office level why this matters. So first, from the public defender's office level, what we do every day as public defenders is we ensure that the due process rights of all of our clients are protected as the government is alleging things that can take somebody's liberty away. And we do that in the context of this giant machine of mass incarceration, which you probably all know is a system that is steeped in racism and continues to basically create intergenerational trauma and poverty and pain for Black and brown individuals, and particularly Black immigrants, most of all, but all immigrants as well. There's a flip side to that coin, which is the system of mass deportation. And the system of mass deportation and mass incarceration work very much the same. They're based on dehumanization and fear mongering to continue a machine that does what it does. So the models are actually very similar between mass incarceration and mass deportation, and they're interlinked. They feed into each other. So the majority of people that get placed in deportation proceedings actually get placed there directly from contact with the criminal legal system. And so that's kind of the intersection of where the rubber meets the road in terms of removal defense. And that's why public defenders' offices have very much an interest in ensuring that our clients' due process rights, which in the criminal context are protected by the government and by an acknowledgement by the government that due process is a constitutional right, and that each individual whose liberty is at stake shouldn't have to fight in a legal system without having an attorney to represent them. And therefore, we have public defenders, right? So if you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided to you. You've all heard the Miranda rights on TV and everything. Well, unfortunately, in the immigration context, even though your liberty rights are equally, if not at greater stake in terms of, indefinite detention, lifelong separation from your family, possible deportation to a place where your very life and the life of your family may be in danger. Even though there's that much at stake, we don't currently have a situation in which the government has acknowledged the due process rights of immigrants to have free legal defense funded by the government. So that's where we're at. And that's why we're cobbling together as much as we can. That's why we're trying to put together all these legal services, particularly in the removal defense context. But I do want to say that overall with the county, I wanted to echo what Nora said about safety net and also trust. So these are two really, I can't stress these points enough. One is safety net, Nora touched on it, so I won't belabor it. But the point is really, really critical. It's just like when we worry about, the systems of mass incarceration and other things like that, we see that if people are excluded from our service array, then what happens is when things get really bad, they end up having to take advantage of government, public sector safety net services, right? Whether that's due to homelessness, poverty, health issues, because they don't get access to free healthcare depending on where you are and depending on your status. All of these things are safety net issues that at that stage, when it gets to that level of problem, cost a lot of money too. And again, to Nora's point, it's not just the financial calculus that we're doing here. There's principles at stake about what we are as a society, how welcoming we are, how we take care of each other, whether we do believe in due process. But on top of that, from a county level, what's in it for the county? Well, it just also makes good fiscal prudent sense to ensure that we are providing an array of services and inclusion for our immigrant populations, whether undocumented or having some form of status, such that they can be included in the entire service array and kept out of our our safety net systems and routed to the important services that counties do provide. Our county has tremendous array of services, and our cities have great services. But the problem often, especially in the political climate, is that there is no trust among a lot of immigrant community members with government. And so the other piece that's really important about the government side of these kinds of services, not just the legal services, but I'll go on about some of what our program at Stand Together Contra Costa does, is that it's also a way to build trust, to show that our local government, whether it's at the county level or the city level, cares and recognizes the importance of immigrants as essential parts of our community, not as dehumanized outsiders, but as critical parts of everything that we do as a community. And therefore, we need to make sure that the government side puts their money where their mouth is, right? Puts effort into recognizing that a lot of the discourse and a lot of the barriers, including language barriers and so forth, have created a giant trust problem. So that's part of why we wanted to ensure that we created this program. And in order to do so, we didn't just make it a program that provides legal services. So our program, for example, really has kind of three essential components. One component is the legal services, and we can talk about that, but I think you're all pretty familiar with the array. There's removal defense, there's also affirmative immigration legal services that people need. And there's also access to other legal services that are civil in nature, but for which immigrants have particular vulnerabilities. For example, housing and eviction defense. We're all familiar right now with the looming housing crisis and everything like that. And immigrants are extra susceptible to unscrupulous landlords who try to leverage their immigration status in order to either run them out and evict them, or to really have them live in untenable conditions. So I believe that where we are right now, so that's kind of the legal services side. But then what we have is we also have our community engagement side, right? And that's really critical for us. We figured we can't just, especially as government, right? If we're going to have the county seal on anything that we're doing, if we're going to be saying this is a program of the county, we need to ensure that we're not just expecting immigrants to come to us and to understand what it is. We need to go where immigrant populations feel secure, where they feel like they have a sense of community and they have a sense of safety. And that's where we need to make these connections. And so our program from the very beginning was really based on community engagement. We not only had a 24-hour hotline, both for rapid response in case there was suspected ICE activity to help make people quell fear, but also we did a lot of community engagement events. So we do all of our community intakes and so forth, places like churches, schools, libraries, community centers, and we have staff, literally community engagement specialists that put together these events, do the outreach, make sure that people come. And I'm going to talk more about that later. So that's another component there. So we have our removal defense services, we have our hotline, which I mentioned, and then we have our community engagement teams, which really ensure that the community knows what we're up to, right? It's not enough just to have services. You have to also have good communication. And that's why when we're talking about public-private partnerships, I really think we should be adding one more word there. I think it's public-private community partnerships. And I'm going to get to that in a second. But I really believe that in terms of what's going on, we're at a transitionary stage for immigration legal services in particular. Because as I mentioned, I believe that the future is that it should be recognized as a due process right for all immigrants whose liberty interests are at stake, especially those obviously in removal proceedings, to have free access to legal services funded by public dollars, right? That's the long-term vision and goal. Just like we have public defenders, which by the way, we only got nationally in the 1960s, if you can believe that, right? So this is a model that has to come in the future. So we're at a transition stage and figuring out what we as government, we as philanthropy do with this process is really, really important. How can we scale this so that we have sustainable solutions going on in the future? Not just for the services we provide, but for the service providers. And I just wanted to amplify some of what was talked about regarding burnout, secondary trauma, and so forth. That means that these collaboratives that we're setting up and service provision systems that we're setting up need to have the long run in mind, right? We need to build opportunity for advancement for our legal service providers, whether we're talking about paralegals, whether we're talking about attorneys, whether we're talking about our community engagement specialists. And we need to ensure that we're setting up a healthy system that's flexible enough to morph with the future of what this is going to look like. So for the considerations for the government side, you know, I'm going to go into a little bit of detail in terms of kind of our program and how we did it. But for us, it was really, like I said, it was a public-private community partnership. So our program was really precipitated by our local coalition called the Contra Costa Immigrant Rights Alliance, which was a coalition of organizations, both service provision organizations and advocacy organizations that were interested in protecting immigrant rights and advancing immigrant rights in our community. And we at the Contra Costa Immigrant Rights Alliance saw the urgent need for increased legal services, but not just increased legal services, that the need for an actual investment by our public officials and our public institutions in recognizing the value of immigrants to our community and ensuring that we want to show that we want immigrants here. And therefore, we were going to provide the services to be able to provide you due process, to screen your case, and to link you up with attorneys to help you do all of that. So, you know, when we did that, the community got together, we started meeting with philanthropy. So, you know, how did we do it? How did we raise the money for Stand Together Contra Costa? Well, the Contra Costa Immigrant Rights Alliance started making calls, right? We called our wonderful partners in philanthropy that fund many of our nonprofit organizations and advocacy organizations that were part of the Alliance. And we started talking to them about this idea. And lo and behold, of course, philanthropy was already thinking about these ideas as well. So philanthropy was very into it. And we got our meetings with elected officials as well. And we kind of talked about this need. And once we had philanthropy actually involved, we wanted to basically bring everybody together in the same room. So when we would meet with you know, our elected officials, it wouldn't just be philanthropy meeting with the elected officials, and it wouldn't just be the community groups meeting with the elected officials. It would be all of us. So we'd go in, we'd have a meeting with representatives from philanthropy, with elected officials, and with community representatives, and talk about the urgent needs. And we just had such great conversations that were really collaborative. It was really, really important and awe-inspiring for us. And so some of it, frankly, from a community perspective, and I know here we have a lot of government folks and philanthropy folks, but I wanted to name this for you, where we have to make sure we're bringing community at the table. And when you bring community at the table, it's not just to check the box to bring community at the table. Community has a lot to actually offer to these processes and setting up these kinds of collaboratives. And that includes not only having a better understanding of the array and being able to make sure that as you launch collaboratives like this, you already have trusted messengers from the community kind of backing the play, but also there's a little bit of matchmaking involved, right? Everybody loves to leverage their dollars. This is what I've learned. I'm not in philanthropy and I'm not like an elected official, but this is what I've learned is leveraging dollars is magic for everybody. Everybody wants their dollars to go further because we want our equity dollars, right? Whether those are dollars coming from the government to provide equity for our community, whether they're coming from philanthropy to provide equity for our community. We want all those dollars to be used as effectively as possible. And that's the concept of leverage, right? The problem is oftentimes no one wants to make the first move, right? So it's kind of like old school matchmaking. I'm from Iran, and my mom is kind of one of those ace matchmakers that can just like hook up anybody. She meets somebody and she's like, okay, this person would be perfect for that person. Let's throw a party and get everybody together and make this thing happen, right? And so sometimes it felt like that when we were getting our program started, right? We wanted to kind of bring the electeds that were very interested in this project with the philanthropic folks that were interested in the project and get them in the room together, right? Let's start talking. Let's talk about what your interests are in terms of what you need for the community and what you want to do with your equity dollars. And county, let's talk about that, and let's figure out where there's synergy there. So I just think that's really, really critical. You need to find champions, both elected champions, but the other piece is in the county systems are large, they're very bureaucratic. And so, for example, in our case, we had me at the public defender's office. So the public defender's office, with our experience in indigent removal defense, providing free indigent criminal defense, providing free legal services to people that need it, whose due process rights are at risk, we were a natural fit to be kind of a county agency that could also talk about what are the logistics with actually providing legal services from a county level. Now, what we also did is when we finally got the funding, and what we did with ours is it was a pilot project, and the county invested $500,000 and philanthropy invested about $650,000 originally. And to get that money, we put that together, and then we issued an RFP. But the community already had gotten together through having been organized through the Contra Costa Immigrant Rights Alliance. And we ended up having a collaborative that was not only made up of county service providers, but our local nonprofits as well. And I'm gonna just go real quick on a piece of it, because I wanted to talk about some of the things with flexibility that are important. So we partnered with many agencies, including Catholic Charities of the East Bay, Jewish Family Community Services of the East Bay. We partnered with agencies that do community engagement work, such as Faith in Action East Bay, such as Bay Area Community Resources. So our collaborative really has a lot of different moving parts, and a lot of nonprofits are part of it and funded through this program. But what that allows us to do is coordinate, and it allows us to build capacity. As I think one of the other speakers was mentioning, I think it was Sally. Building capacity is really important. So for example, what we did is through our partnership with Catholic Charities, we were able to provide them funding for long enough and technical assistance on removal defense that then they got the 3 years requisite experience in removal defense. So then they became eligible for state dollars to be able to provide those kinds of services. And then we were able to move them off of our books, off of our funding stream, and onto the state stream. So that's part of what we need to do here. The other thing that was really important about the community engagement side of it and the flexibility is that we were able, because we're trusted to provide not just legal services, but we go to where the community is we were able to be flexible with the needs as the community told us the needs, right? So as the public charge changes happen, for example, what we ended up doing is we partnered with the Community Clinic Consortium and had them come to all of our events where we were providing free legal consultations and so forth, and providing Know Your Rights trainings and so forth. But we also would start providing public charge trainings because that's what the community had questions about. And because we were trusted, we figured why not use this as an opportunity to provide this information to the community. Same thing with the census. When the census came around, we were the county department at the Public Defender's Office and through Stand Together Contra Costa that had the most robust relationships with immigrant community members. And so we got very involved in the census work and incorporated that into all of our work. So it's really important to keep this flexible and all of that. And then with the flexibility, that also brings the public-private partnerships, public-private community partnerships, bring opportunities for raising other issues, for example, as was touched upon in the earlier presentations about Afghan and so forth. Afghan asylum seekers and Haitian asylum seekers. So through Stand Together Contra Costa, we have relationships with electeds. Then, for example, recently, our elected Congressman Mark Tessonnier was doing an immigration-based town hall with that. They came to stand together, Contra Costa, to ask, hey, what's going on? What do people want to hear about and talk about? And then we were able to tap in our partners at Jewish Family Community Services, at Haitian Bridge Alliance, to be part of that important discussion. So this is all really exciting stuff, very, very important. And what's happening now is these opportunities, as you show that this works, you have opportunities to build on that. And one of the biggest needs we see right now is non-detained removal defense. So there's, as Sally mentioned, there's a lot of good services in the Bay Area for removal defense, but a lot of it tends to focus on detained removal defense, those that are in detention. Whereas we actually are seeing great needs with asylum seekers who are not detained, and we're having to turn them away currently because we don't have the capacity. So we're trying to get that money right now through Measure X and leverage public dollars and private dollars to do that. So I know my time is up. I'm happy to answer any questions. I'm very, very excited to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your remarks. And we are going to pivot to questions here in a moment. So folks would like to feel free to drop them in the chat. And I'm just going to start with a quick recap of some of what I heard from you too. I was writing so much down. I love some of the lines that you were sharing. One of the things that stuck out to me, you talked about how this work is a representation of the principles we have as a society, and whether we're going to welcome each other, take care of each other, whether we believe in due process, whether we want to make people feel like essential parts of our community and not outsiders. Those things are all strongly resonant with me, and I suspect all of the folks who are dialed into this morning's conversation. I also thought it was really interesting when you talked about how the investments were also a signal to the community. So there is the actual literal impact of the services, but there's also this broader implication for what it means in terms of feeling like the government is there to support you. It's a place that can be trusted. We heard Sally earlier talk about how people actually want to know that something's official by hearing from trusted folks in government. So I thought that was a really important point as well. And then, to your sort of kind of joking about sort of the matchmaking, I think it's true. We'll have opportunity for some small breakout groups after this, but just in general as a practice for philanthropy, for folks in government in the call today, to really think about just picking up the phone, sending an email, and sort of talking about what the needs are in the community that can jointly be tackled. So thank you so much for sharing all of your great information. And we're going to pivot to questions here. I have a bunch for you, but we're going to start and see what's in the chat. And we probably have a little more than 10 minutes for this before we move on to our next section. But there was a question about sanctuary cities, which, obviously you don't have to be a sanctuary city or a jurisdiction to provide coordinated legal services. But there was an invitation for anyone who would like to reflect on how that might tie into the question of legal service delivery.
I could start, Kevin. The concept of or the use of the term sanctuary city, sanctuary county, I feel there was a little bit of movement away from that as, terminology gets politicized in ways are often used against the original intent. So the term sanctuary was often meant sort of literally as you would think of it, as a place of safe haven for immigrants. And just the term hasn't been as popular as it had been previously, like, during the 80s, for example. However, there were a lot of efforts from counties to provide different kinds of safety net services and protections and supports for immigrants. And as far as how that's played out specifically at the counties, I would imagine actually some of our representatives from the counties would have more to say about that. But I'll see if my colleagues from the legal services side have anything to add.
Right, so I'll also, go ahead.
No, I think you nailed it. Oh, sorry, go ahead. That's it. I think Sally nailed it. I don't have anything.
Thank you. So one of the questions I had, I'll take moderator's prerogative here while we wait to see if any more questions populate. You talked about the success that you had, Nora. I think you said it was 60% of the cases that you had actually taken on were successful. And the portion of cases you took on, I think it was 90 out of 500 something, And I'm assuming that the decrease between the number screened and the number that were actually taken on was due to sort of the likelihood or their eligibility to actually pursue relief, which raises this bigger question around sort of complex and non-complex cases. And there's obviously cost and capacity implications there. So I would invite you, Sally, Ali, to talk a little about sort of the difference between what it takes to provide representation for complex versus non-complex cases and what the implications for a funder might be in that scenario.
Yeah, if I'm understanding the question correctly, there are different definitions for simple and complex. And of course, it depends on the capacity of the service provider in terms of how they might interpret it. But there are some processes and applications, what we sometimes think of as straightforward cases where someone is clearly eligible and doesn't trigger any of the risks or bars that would either prevent them from being eligible or, more concerning, of course, trigger a risk of detention or deportation, where we see that some cases can be processed in groups. For example, naturalization is a common example where there is a system, there are models in place where people can be processed in groups, meaning they get information about eligibility and what it takes to apply in a group setting, like a group presentation. They go to a large scale or small scale workshop to have help filling out the application, assembling their documentation and forms and applications so that they can apply. However, even in the context of naturalization, there's also complexity where, again, someone doesn't have a clear record of who their identity is, if they've traveled in and out of the United States, they have had a criminal record. And so that's one example. Of course, removal defense is complex for a number of different reasons. Inherent to the process is the risk of being deported if someone's in front of an immigration judge, as well as just the timeline of how immigration courts work. One of our service providers, who I don't believe is on the call anymore, but mentioned that it can take 7 years or more for a removal case to wind its way through the courts. In addition to just being a long amount of time for a legal services provider to hold that case, there's a lot that can happen to our immigrant clients in those 7 years. Interaction with immigration, interaction with the criminal legal system, all sorts of things that could change their eligibility, as well as changes to that immigration benefit or option. And so, I think in some ways those are the extremes, like a straightforward naturalization case. Someone already has status and clearly is eligible to already at risk of being detained or deported because they're in front of an immigration judge. But there's a lot in between. And these definitions of what are complex and what are simple also change as policy and adjudications change. So that's why it's hard to have like a one size fits all in terms of a reimbursement rate or a fee for service, and why often our legal services partners are pushing for we have to hire staff. We have to hire staff to handle these cases, and the numbers change depending on a number of different factors.
Thank you, Sally. And Nora, I think you wanted to hop in as well.
Yeah, I think I just wanted to make one clarification, and it's also kind of a flag and part of the lessons learned that maybe I didn't mention or didn't come across as clearly. But for the drop off between the number of cases screened and the number of cases actually where representation was provided had to do with several reasons, including some probably because of what Sally mentioned, but really mostly in the LA experience. A lot of it had to do with some of the requirements and some of the restrictions that we had in the program. So the program was not a universal representation program. We've been making progress incrementally and are hopeful that we're heading towards something like that, but it wasn't. And so both the criminal carve-outs, right, and also some onerous residency requirements or proof of residency requirements. And that was part of the lessons learned as the program was evolving, to make sure that we took a step back and remove some of those barriers for representation as we went forward. So for example, there were, the city had a waiver available for criminal carve-out cases, right? And as we think about the next iteration of the Justice Fund, what does that look like for those requirements so that we don't have that huge drop off between those that actually need the services, right, and those that actually are receiving them.
Thank you for that clarification, Nora. And it looks like we have a question that's come here through the chat. Nate, do you want to unmute yourself and share your question? Oh, You're still muted. Let's see if we can get you unmuted.
Sorry, sorry about that. Yes, it's more something we've heard in the greater Boston area, and I'm curious if this resonates with others, that under the prior administration, the apparatus, which has largely remained intact, that, you know, many cases and applications, even affirmative ones, were getting denied and rejected on the basis of clerical errors. And so as more, as CBOs and DOJ accredited groups try to, you know, add to the capacity, just that sort of the burden and the, you know, the concern around making sure that that applications were really carefully handled and monitored, so that even affirmative cases weren't being tossed out. So I'm curious if that resonates with others as something that in a prior landscape wouldn't have been a sort of added burden and complexity to representation, but even what should be easy cases requiring a higher level of sort of oversight and staff support.
Thanks for getting some affirmation in the chat. I don't know if anyone of our speakers wants to directly respond to that, but maybe while you're thinking, I can share another question here. And, you know, this is primarily, I guess, for you, Nora and Ali. You talked earlier about sort of finding creative ways to measure the impact of this work that go beyond just the numbers. And I'm wondering if you can share a little bit about your perspective about how you in government try to capture or think about some of those more ephemeral benefits, if you will, that aren't just sort of like the hard numbers.
So I'll jump in and I'll be quick. I think it's a work in progress. I think it's something that we are still, you know, grappling with, and how to really capture accurately all the tangential benefits, the less graspable benefits of a program like this. I think our philanthropy partners have been crucial in this too, in the sense of ensuring that when we are reporting, when we're collecting data, et cetera, it's not just numbers, it's not just the hard data, but what is the narrative that goes with that? How do we capture in a different way the many benefits? How do we do a snapshot of how families are being impacted, entire families, entire communities? So it's a struggle that we continue to work through, but I think it just has to be every time we talk about the measuring the success of a program like this, we just have to take that step back and make sure that we're not just focusing on the numbers, but rather those other impacts as well. And that's just part of a continuing job that hopefully we'll get there eventually. But I think it's a good reminder for both localities that have programs like this or are thinking about instituting programs, and also for philanthropy, right? What does success look like, and agreeing from the onset and making that very clear for everyone.
Can I just add to that? I think that, you know, there's the quantifiable metrics that obviously we all try to track and do all of that. But in terms of the other piece, that's where, you know, the service providers aren't always the best folks to actually execute that piece. So in terms of the qualitative impacts, that's where having, you know, outside help, for example, right now, we, in our county, we're going through a Gateways for Growth grant process, where we're trying to see a lot of the downstream impacts beyond simply the number of people served and what kinds of applications we filed or things like that. And I think it brings up an issue of messaging, right? We need to do a better job of messaging both to the stakeholders, the public stakeholders and the private stakeholders, back to philanthropy and government, but also to the community, the extended qualitative benefits of these programs. And I don't have an easy answer for that. So that's where we're looking to, you know, folks in government and philanthropy to help with that. We can tap in, but that's not necessarily, at least for my program, that's not within our capacity or wheelhouse.
Thank you. So I'm going to give you a moment here, just offer a final reflection before we pivot. But I just want to lift up very quickly something that was sort of addressed earlier that I think is worth repeating, which is the fact that when there is a gap in services from government or philanthropy to provide representation opportunities, it's not just, well, it's status quo, but the window is opened for those unscrupulous actors to sneak in. So I think that's a part of the calculus to try to think about it as well. It's almost like, how do you measure the negative of not doing the investment? And that is a real risk for communities who are in need of services and desperate when they're not provided. Just wanted to sort of lift that back up. But we are going to pivot to the next portion of our agenda shortly. But I want to offer you guys a chance to share a final reflection. We have a great committed group of government and philanthropic stakeholders who are on the line with us. And you have deep experience working with immigrant communities, doing public-private partnerships. What are your closing thoughts, recommendations that you'd want to share? And maybe Sally, we'll start with you.
Shoot, there were two things, and I was trying to write it down before I forget because I have terrible memory. One is the first is I'd say, I think we heard from Nora and Ali and I that I think as immigrant advocates, we are really trying to move away from the commodification of immigrants and the value of immigrants and their contributions to our society being measured solely by their contribution to the economy, their labor output. And so I think we're struggling with metrics in general. There's been a real shift towards metrics in the last decade or two as the way we communicate the impact of our work, as the way our work is also valued. And what we've seen is a real, as I said, a commodification of immigrants, a real quantification that the value of our labor that is moving and shifting. And it's frustrating, I know, for folks who want to know how to support our work when we say, well, it depends. It depends on the service provider, it depends on the community, it depends on the client, it depends on the circumstances of that client. But the truth is that now more than ever, that is how immigration legal services feels and works. Things are constantly changing, communities are changing, and we are really attempting as a field to expand out to more communities, to meet the diversity, to grow into our goals of racial justice and racial equity in this state. And that means really having to flex new muscles, reach into new communities ourselves. And so I would say that that's a theme that I see a lot in the immigration legal services field. The other thing is an investment up and down the chain of services. What looks like sometimes is, I think sometimes attorneys are considered at the top of the food chain, and we're realizing that's really not the case. This work really needs to be community-centered and client-centered, and the community itself, impacted community members, are such a critical part of the services, being themselves the trusted leaders, the ones who are going to really help move the community, both to services and to advocacy, has been really critical. What we've seen that's really exciting is when we engage communities, meaning sometimes smaller CBOs, community-based organizations, or really volunteer-led groups as part of the education and outreach efforts, many of them are actually moving to legal services. They're like, hey, now that I'm doing the education and outreach, which I feel strongly about, I'm the person people call now about, hey, is public charge going to impact me? Am I eligible for this thing? How do I fill out this form? And we see nonprofits then themselves moving into legal services provision because they can become DOJ recognized and accredited. And that's really exciting to see because we really need to have directly impacted community members as part of this service model. So an investment all along kind of the chain of services, I think, is going to help us move towards having more legal services available for more people. And that's sort of my final reflection from this conversation. So thank you so much.
So thank you, Sally. Let's go to you next, Nora, and we'll try to do these kind of quickly.
Yeah, thank you. I think the only thing that I want to just leave everyone with is two things. The investment and the collaboration in this investment was really worth the time and effort that it's taken to continually evaluate and evolve the program to increase impact on the ground. And so I do encourage those of you who are considering doing this or who want to learn a little bit more about our experience, please do reach out. Happy to provide additional insights on the lessons learned or anything else. And then the other just sort of final thought is, I think the other mantra has been flexibility, right? Making sure that we both at the government level and the philanthropy level, that there isn't such rigidity in the program, in the requirements, in the vision, in the scope, in all of those things, so that we're not sort of tying ourselves to something that may not turn out to be as responsive as things change so drastically on the ground continuously, right? Because we have changes in policies, because we have different communities that we're welcoming in our cities, different profiles and needs. So just again, keeping in mind that very much that need to continually evaluate and add flexibility to these programs to make them responsive.
Thank you so much, Nora. And Ali, if you can close us out.
Sure. Just really briefly, I would say that, you know, for our program, what we saw was, going back to that leverage point, was also the coordination among local philanthropic organizations, including community foundations. That what we had is, we had a group that was brought together. YNH Soda Foundation, who I see Luis is on the call, did a tremendous job bringing together a bunch of local funders to talk about these issues, because a lot of local funders might not have enough money in their portfolio to be able to fund an entire launch of a pilot program. But by pooling resources, we were able to do so. So both philanthropy getting together and working together with community, and then working with government, what you can do is you can use philanthropic dollars to leverage public investment in these pilot programs, and then measure the success, show the success, and then you can transition away from philanthropic funding to public funding. For example, our program now is almost 95% funded by government, even though in the beginning it was something like 60% philanthropy, 40% government. So you know, get together and collaborate, and let's pool our resources to provide these important new services, while we're transitioning to a future where everyone will have the right to legal representation without us having to pool together nickels and dimes to make it happen.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sally, Nora, Ali. Maybe we can get some virtual high fives, some claps, some cheers for our speakers who did an amazing job sharing information with us. I really appreciate you joining, and hopefully you can stick around, but know you may need to sign off. And I'm going to turn it over to Julie, who will take us to the next part of the agenda. Thanks again.
Great. Thank you, Kevin, for moderating, and for all of our amazing speakers throughout the day. This has been such an excellent resource, I think, for everyone on the line. So now we're going to move into small group discussions and get a chance to really connect with each other and share a bit about, you know, our own experiences, kind of the, you know, what we're facing in terms of the resources we're trying to provide, the challenges we're having, the successes we're having. And so, so let me just share here really quickly. And so for our breakout group discussions today, it's a lot of questions, no need to answer them all, but just a chance to really discuss in your small groups, share a little bit about your key takeaways from the presentations, share a bit about the needs in your communities for immigrants that you're seeing and that you're serving, the kinds of services that you're currently funding or providing for immigrants, and what kinds of barriers you're having when you're facing kind of funding services for immigrants, and then also specifically for legal services. And then also, what supports and resources would you need to implement a public-private partnership that serves the needs of immigrants? And so those are the questions that we'll walk away with and bring into our small groups. And Nikita has arranged small groups so that you'll have a chance to kind of share with folks in your similar region that cross both funders and local governments. So hopefully we get a good mix of folks. We know some people will need to leave, but we'll have a small group facilitator in each group as well. And you'll be automatically transferred. And if for some reason you're not, you can click the join button. We'll just have about 15 minutes to chat in our small groups, and then we'll come back together, and the facilitators will report out some highlights from your group, so we all get a chance to hear what was said in other groups as well. And then after that, we will have a couple folks, Navin and Sara, share some additional resources, and we'll do a closing poll and activity. So that will be our last item for the day. So look forward to seeing you guys back in the main room in about 15 minutes. Welcome back, everyone. Let me just get to the right screen here. Okay. So we know that was short. We were running a little bit behind on our speakers presentation, but hopefully you had a small enough group where you got to all share and hear from each other. So we'd love to hear from folks, and starting with the facilitators, just a few highlights from each of your groups of what you discussed and answering some of these questions here. So let's see, who would like to start? Kevin, would you like to start?
Sure. So we did have a good conversation. There was a lot of different ideas that came up, and I'm just going to quickly throw some of them out. One of the pieces that came up was just this idea or this trend that a lot of the places where there are legal service systems in place, public legal service systems, are actually the areas that are too expensive for many immigrant communities to live. And so it creates this imbalance between sort of where the resources are and where the communities are. And so how to like build better partnerships and resources. Another big theme that came up was sort of the disparity between the civil legal service system and the immigrant legal service system, and the need to stop siloing those two sectors and really looking from like almost a person first model, like this is an individual who happens to need legal services, and how does the community and funders work together to get that done, as opposed to being competition for like a very small amount of money. And then the last thing I'll share was there was some plus ones on like the idea of like the commodification of the work being a challenge, and also needing to be more creative in defining success in serving community. I think there was a couple other pieces, but I will leave there so we can hear from some of the other groups as well.
Excellent, great. Sada, would you like to go next? You know, we can't hear you, actually. Can't hear you. I'll pick on someone else for now and then come back to you, but it's like I can almost hear you, but it's barely there. Okay, how about we go with Navin?
I was in the same group as Sada, so Sada, jump in.
Great.
If you are you able to get on? I can start, and so Sada, you can jump in if I forget anything. But we were a pretty small group also. There was just kind of talk about just even as providers not doing necessarily legal service provision, just this presentation has kind of brought up just how important that is, and the idea of being DOJ accredited was also of interest for folks who are not attorneys or lawyers, and being able to kind of access that kind of resource and service. We also talked about just because legal services are also critical, and there's just so much need, doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, groups that are doing, you know, other kinds of service provision need to actually be legal service providers themselves, that there can be collaboration with folks so that you can make referrals to. So that's not like adding one more thing to a community-based organization's work, but actually developing relationships and partnerships with other organizations in your community to be able to refer people out to that, so that we don't have those issues that was mentioned earlier with notarios. We also talked about, and just kind of plus oneing what people were saying about just the critical role of government as a source of trust too, and the role that we just can't forget that. And so we do have community-based organizations that are trusted in the community, but the government is also seen as a trusted source too, and to be able to access that. We also just talked about like just, you know, like that you can be providing services to like the general population, but that's also providing services to immigrants too. And so in particular, we talked about rental assistance, utility assistance too. And so how when we think about the demographics in California and or in our communities, that the work, whether targeting immigrants or not, or just on specific issues, really does impact and benefit a lot of people. I think that that is it on with my notes, but if anyone in my group wants to join in or jump in to add other things, I welcome you to do so.
I think you covered it. I don't know if people can hear me now.
We can, yeah.
Okay, good.
Excellent. Okay, how about, can we hear from Ivy next?
Sure. So we had a great conversation. A couple of things resonated with the folks in our group, collaborating, pooling of resources, and the importance of both affirmative as well as removal defense, the infrastructure of the field, and the pressure that the pipeline is facing for, again, supporting both affirmative and removal defense, and the importance of collaborative approaches that will actually lighten those burdens and not burning through staff. Also, something that had come up is, how to support direct services versus policy advocacy, and what is the appropriate balance? Should that be shifted towards one direction or another? And I think there was a consensus that it should be both and really lifting up like hyper-local work that is happening at that level. And then final piece that we talked about is also how wage theft has become very common and acute during, especially during this time of the past year with the pandemic. And so, how can legal services be inclusive of supporting what, often is siloed in philanthropy as economic justice, and merging the two between economic justice and immigrant justice to support immigrant communities in that respect.
Great, thank you, Ivy. And lastly, in our group, a few of the topics that we covered from someone from Santa Clara County Office of Immigrant Relations, just describe the importance of really wanting to do public-private partnerships to really help scale it up, to streamline it. So just very interested in seeking, starting that work. We had someone from East Palo Alto who also shared a bit around just the burdens and the challenges of even accepting public funding because of all the reporting requirements and everything else that goes along with it, and also the challenges around just capacity generally and having to refer out so many cases because there just isn't the internal capacity as well. And so another point as well that was brought up was just this idea of making sure that nonprofit service providers are involved in the formation of public-private partnerships, right? That they are key and center in creating those. And then there's also some conversation around public trust. So that was a bit of our group. And so thank you all. I hope you had good conversations, got to connect with some new folks in the room. And I'm going to hand it over to Sara Campos and Navin from Grove Foundation, Zellerbach Family. And we have a short little activity and some closing resources that they will lead.
Yeah. So we're just going to close it out today. We want to, first of all, just thank you for your attention and kind of being part of this conversation right now. We know that we're all in different places. We all have different roles. And so some of the ideas, some of the collaborations and partnerships that were presented today may seem a little daunting or overwhelming if you're trying to think about raising $11 million or something like that to support legal services. But I think that we know that there are some things that we all can do moving forward in terms of providing services, supporting immigrant communities. And so Sara and I have some ideas of ways that you can be more involved in helping to be more inclusive, be more welcoming, to integrate immigrants in your community. So I think Nikita put up a poll, and these are just some ideas that we have. They are not exhaustive in any way, but we thought that they would be really just great, like next steps for folks. And so Sara, can you just kind of walk us through them?
Right, okay, I'll just read these. The first one is, I will explore public-private partnership opportunities in my community. I will help to increase services, including immigration legal services for immigrants in my community. I will share what I learned at this convening with colleagues. There's lots of information that we shared during the forum, the scan itself, various other resources that SC WorkKey provided. I will share the legal services scan with my network. I will reach out to one or more immigration serving organizations in my community to learn about it. And let's see, I am planning to make direct investments in immigration legal services for my community. Maybe this stirred up some interest, and maybe you got paired with a few folks in your community that you can talk to about putting together a collaboration. I'd like to participate in a working group with others to discuss public-private partnerships to support immigrant legal services. As you might have gathered, this isn't the last conversation that we're going to have on this topic, and we hope if there's interest that you will join us in further discussion of how we can move this work forward in a more robust way. I want to learn and to receive support in other ways. Please specify what you'd like to support or learn. And we welcome any and all of your ideas in the chat. And again, I hope this isn't the final conversation. I hope we can be in touch together. I hope you got something out of these presentations and to be in conversation in the future.
Excellent. Thank you, Sada. And so looking at the poll, let's see, it looks like, thanks for everyone that took the poll as well. It looks like you're all committed to a lot of action after this, which is great. And again, as Sada said, I think we want this to be an ongoing conversation to figure out how to really support this work and, support public-private partnerships or public-private community partnerships in the future. So thank you. So I also just wanted to say thank you again to all of our partners, GCIR, Grantmakers Concerned with Immigrants and Refugees, the GROW Foundation, Zellerbach Family Foundation, all of our amazing presenters for sharing the wealth of knowledge that you shared with us, and also everyone on the line today, including the great questions you asked, the experiences you shared with each other. So we definitely just appreciate all of the commitment again to kind of providing immigration services and the work that you do. So thank you all. And would anyone else like to share a few closing words? All right, excellent. Well, thank you all. And we look forward to following up with you with the resources that were shared today. So we will be in touch. Thanks for joining.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.